Hello.
Hello.
How is everyone?
Doing well, doing well. How about you?
Good, thank you. Hi, Matt.
Hello, hello. Okay, we have Qian here, we have Danielle here. Danielle, would you like to share your video, or am I to do it?
I believe it's up to, I believe it's I can do it or you can do it either way, whatever is easier. I uploaded the WebM version. I don't know if you would prefer an MP4, which one would play better, but
Let me try the WebM right now. Danielle, what number was your presentation?
15.
Okay, I'm just going to briefly test if Danielle's recording works. So let me know, give me a thumbs up if you can hear this.
My name is Natalia Barbour, and I will be presenting a paper that I co-authored.
Perfect, thank you so much.
That works. That's just not my recording.
That is my recording. Yeah, that was my recording, but I do not see the first slide. We can't hear you, Dr. Nikhil Menon and Professor Fred Mannering. We'll be discussing work from home during COVID-19 and beyond. Let me introduce Jill and Jack. Jill and Jack were regular people traveling back and forth from work before the pandemic. They were going to their respective workplaces.
So I'm assuming there's supposed to be a screen visible. Yeah, okay. It appears to not be working. Yeah, okay. And then I want to try as well. Let's see if it might be on my end.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation. My name is Danielle Sperry. I am
Can you
a
hear that?
industrial organizational master's candidate
Okay.
and graduate research assistant at Clemson University.
Okay, everyone, welcome. We're just getting set up. And just give me one quick moment. Alrighty, welcome everyone to the third track, the Western track of the BTR conference. My name is Matt Palm. I'm a research fellow at the University of Toronto, and I'll be moderating this session. Today we're going to start with Danielle Sperry. Danielle is a second-year MS student in applied psychology program with an industrial organizational concentration at Clemson University. She graduated with a dual BS degree in psychology and human development from Virginia Tech. Her current research interests focus on issues related to occupational health psychology, including work-family interface and economic stress. She began her graduate assistantship with the WEAVE program. WEAVE stands for Preparing the Workforce for the Era of Automated Vehicles project in August 2020. And as part of the WEAVE team, her main job responsibilities include coding, recruitment, and developing of manuscripts. So do you want to add any more to your introduction, or should I jump into the video? Video's good?
Yeah, I think video is good. That summed it up pretty well, I think.
Awesome, fantastic. And folks, just give me a wave or a message if you can't hear it.
Thank you for tuning into this presentation. My name is Danielle Sperry. I am a industrial organizational master's candidate and graduate research assistant at Clemson University. And today I'm very excited to be presenting my team's research on trucking in the era of COVID-19. This research was conducted through the National Research Foundation's funded project, WEAVE, or Preparing the Future Workforce for the Era of Automated Vehicles. The goal of WEAVE is to analyze the impacts of AVs that they will have on various transportation sectors, as well as investigating how worker skills can adapt in the new climate. As we conducted our research, COVID-19 emerged as a prominent theme impacting workers in the trucking industry. Among many things, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic had profound impacts on the country's economy. The COVID-19 pandemic signified the worst economic impact to the U.S. society since the Great Depression. Around 26 million U.S. Americans had to file for unemployment, and in the first 2 quarters of 2020, 49,000 truck drivers lost their jobs. Once a national emergency was declared in the U.S., trucking activity increased in certain sectors due to panic buying and stay-at-home orders. This led to e-commerce sales accelerating during the pandemic, growing over 30% between the first and second quarters of 2020. These changes in demand and on supply chains have presented the industry with numerous challenges. These challenges have put the trucking industry at the nexus of economic and health concerns related to the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact of COVID-19 on the trucking industry varies based upon the organization's sector and type of hauled freight. Some industries, such as medical supplies and grocery stores, saw increases, while other sectors, such as the hospitality industry, saw declines. On the road, government sanctions shut down service areas, which complicated conditions for drivers. Even more than that, truck drivers are a particularly vulnerable population during the pandemic. Truck drivers are generally older and male, which makes this group of workers more vulnerable to the negative effects of COVID-19. Although truck drivers can self-isolate to a certain degree while working, their role in delivering essential goods requires them to venture into COVID-19 hotspots for work. This essential worker status and changes in supply chains have produced infrastructure issues, but moreover, these transportation workers already experience high levels of stress, which may have increased as a result of the pandemic. Overall, the full extent of the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic had on the trucking industry is unclear. Through our research, we wanted to gain a better understanding of the impacts experienced in the trucking industry during the COVID-19 pandemic, and additionally, we wanted to examine public perceptions before and during the pandemic. In order to fulfill these research objectives, we utilized multiple types of data. To recruit participants for this study, a list of trucking companies was created from city and regional transportation agencies and firm directories who were then contacted by our research team. Those who agreed to participate in the study completed an online pre-survey and participated in a focus group. The online survey and focus group data was collected from June 2020 to January 2021. The pre-survey was comprised of demographic questions along with questions related to COVID-19 and the trucking industry. Focus groups were conducted virtually on Zoom with a semi-structured protocol, including questions about the impact of COVID on the trucking industry. After a preliminary analysis of the transcripts, there was a total of 21 focus groups with 42 participants. We also sampled publicly available data from Twitter to further investigate the changes in public perception towards the trucking industry on social media. This provided data within a 2-week time window to analyze how the sentiment of public discourse around trucking on social media changed pre and during COVID. Data from the pre-survey were analyzed descriptively. Data from focus groups were coded using a thematic analysis approach by 2 members of the research team using NVivo 12. Both team members read and familiarized themselves with the focus group transcripts. We then performed a line-by-line review of the transcripts to develop initial codes. The codes were then thematically categorized based on the frequency, meaning, and relationship. Finally, we defined each theme, and intercoder reliability was established with a kappa coefficient greater than 0.8. COVID-19 was declared a national emergency in the U.S. on March 13, 2020. To investigate the changes in public perception of the trucking industry during the pandemic, we acquired tweets for a 2-week time window before and after March 13th using Salesforce Marketing Cloud's Radian 6 software. We filtered the tweets to include those that originated in the U.S. and contain either trucker, truckers, or trucking keywords. We also added filters to exclude tweets with certain keywords to reduce noise in the data. Finally, we classified the tweets as either positive, neutral, or negative sentiment using the Salesforce Social Studio's proprietary sentiment model. After independent analysis of the pre-survey, focus groups, and sentiment analysis, they were analyzed together to triangulate the data for data validity. Now for the exciting part, the results. Out of 42 total participants, they were on average 48 years old and predominantly male. These averages are consistent with overall demographic breakdowns in the industry. The majority of the participants were in positions in upper-level management at 57%, followed by drivers at 26% and supervisors at 17%. And unsurprisingly, managers had been working at their company for the longest time of the 3 employee positions. Our survey responses showed that most of the participants thought that COVID-19 affected their work. Out of those 80% that were impacted, the top 3 ways that COVID-19 affected participants' work was by increasing the stress associated with the work, increasing the health risk associated with the work, and increasing the amount of hours time spent working. However, there seems to be a limited negative personal economic impact seen through few participants reporting reduced pay or being laid off. 4 overarching themes emerged from the focus group data analysis. 1, industry changes, 2, company adaptability, 3, company response, and 4, impacts on drivers. The first theme we saw emerge was industry changes through spending habits and operational changes. One manager described this by saying, "In the US, buying habits have changed a lot since COVID. They're spending more on durable goods for their home, so all of that stuff has to be shipped." In the focus groups, participants described the change in consumer buying trends since the start of the pandemic. The pandemic progressed and people were confined to their home, where buying habits reflected this shift in their environment. Participants explained that COVID-19 changed the daily operations in the trucking industry due to supply chain disruptions. Reasons given for these disruptions were vendor work shortages and an inability to ship due to mandatory shutdowns. These inhibitors within the supply chain reduced flexibility and rushed deliveries, since warehouses could no longer keep inventory and many were operating using just-in-time purchasing practices. They stopped doing just-in-time freight, since that's a lot of lost money opportunity seen by managers prioritizing buying and rushing stuff right now. This places additional pressure on drivers to make deliveries on time. With all of these industry-related changes, companies had to adapt in order to survive the pandemic, such as by pivoting markets seen in the driver quote. When COVID first said it was only essential goods, so dispatch and backhaul employees quickly switched over to brokered freight, like getting into other competitors' markets. Participants described infrastructure adaptations that their trucking companies made as a result of COVID-19. From the start of the pandemic, participants noted that the variability of freight volume. Each trucking company had to figure out how to survive through the daily unknowns of what would happen to their company. When the initial shutdown occurred, there was not a lot of business, but as time passed, business seemed to rebounded or even increase, exhibited by one manager saying, "We're actually busier than we have been probably in the last year." The freight volume for each company was contingent on which market they were in, so companies pivoted their business models to stay open and running. Companies abruptly moved into different markets depending on availability and where they established customer relationships. In addition to pivoting the business model, participants described temporary fixes to keep their company afloat during the pandemic. Although employees were laid off from companies, participants noted that these employees were not financially struggling since they benefited from unemployment checks. Upper-level management explained that they learned from previous hard times, such as the recession in 2008, that they needed to have emergency funds in the event of a crisis, where reserves were a relief during COVID-19. Changes in insurance policies to keep the budget balanced were another method explained by participants. Not only did companies need to adapt to stay afloat, but the response to the pandemic varied across organizations. One approach to keep employees safe was discussed by a supervisor, saying, "When we got the shutdown, we stayed open as an office. Our dispatchers, load planners, and everybody else, we came in. But we did lock the drivers because they're traveling all over the country." companies were continuously striving to be responsive to their employees' reactions to COVID-19. Participants explained that some employees were afraid, while other employees were skeptical of the severity of COVID-19. So with certain climate, supervisors are just trying to manage all of these new things. The balancing act seemed rather difficult for companies to manage, but as a whole, participants explained that their companies were focused on their employees during the pandemic and fought hard to keep their workers employed, satisfied, safe, and paid. Participants stated that companies were empathetic to employees' personal and family concerns during this time. In addition to the emphasis placed on individual employees, trucking companies adopted new business protocols aimed at protecting their employees from also initiated remote or isolated work for their employees. Participants described a divided work environment where office employees worked remotely or came into the office, and drivers were kept separate from all office employees. Although the division between drivers and office staff was meant to keep employees safe, participants explained that it created animosity from drivers as well as a morale issue. This leads into our fourth and final theme, impact on drivers. Drivers seem to receive different treatment from companies compared to other employees, and this changed perspective extended to a national scale. One manager said, "Truck drivers were America's heroes as this pandemic started. I said, well, we need to enjoy it while we last because it won't take long. A reputation will get tarnished again just by the mere fact that it's a bad perception." Participants described changes to truck drivers' quality of life resulting from COVID-19 related policy changes and public perceptions. As a result of the pandemic, many businesses indefinitely shut down and there are fewer drivers on the road. In some parts of the U.S., most rest areas and restaurants also ended up being closed. These closures impacted truck drivers' quality of life as it was significantly more difficult to access bathroom facilities or get food while driving. The government was also a sore point for truck drivers, as although they were seen as essential workers, they were not in priority line to get a vaccine, as one driver noted. Truck drivers also contended with threats to their personal safety by traveling to areas experiencing high rates of COVID-19 while delivering goods throughout the pandemic. Delivering to high case zones was reported to cause anxiety for drivers. Not only did drivers' quality of life change due to policy changes made statewide, but their job quality and operations were impacted due to changing vendor protocols. Now protocols restricted the amount of social interaction and normal job duties such as loading and unloading. Participants described changes in the public's perception of truck drivers due to their efforts in delivering goods throughout the pandemic. Participants referred to truck drivers as essential workers and explained that while occupations had the ability to convert to a work-from-home company structure, truck drivers had no option but to deliver supplies in high demand and travel to outside areas. Participants noted that truck drivers have had a poor reputation in recent years due to highly litigious accident cases and misconceptions about the occupation. However, COVID-19 made the public aware and appreciative of truck drivers' work. These results were further corroborated by our findings of public perception of truck drivers on Twitter. After the COVID-19 national emergency, the volume of tweets sharply increased, indicating an increase in public attention towards truck drivers and the overall trucking industry. The sentiment analysis results showed that the proportion of positive tweets increased from 38.3% pre-COVID to 54.8% during COVID, while there are no significant differences in the proportion of negative tweets. This suggests that the public perception became more positive towards the trucking industry, which confirms our findings from the focus groups. To make sense of all the data we collected and analyzed, we deducted 6 main takeaways from our findings. First, fluctuation in revenue depended on the sector that the trucking company resided in. Consistent with the literature, the transportation industry experienced fluctuations in revenue. Some segments experienced more success than others due to fluctuations in consumer demand for particular products like food and home goods. Second, job security was not a main concern during the pandemic for truck drivers. Across the industry, driver shortages are a main concern, always listed at the top of American Trucking Research Institute's top 10 industry concerns. However, this was not reflected by participants' responses. This may be due to temporary reductions of drivers in the trucking industry Or it could also be that drivers view their job security as a future issue, and managers and supervisors are focusing on issues related to survival in the present climate. Third, the key to success for the trucking industry was being able to pivot into new markets. They also shared that the pivoting to new markets, such as brokered freight, may have compensated for supply chain disruptions and have exceeded past years' revenue streams. Fourth, truck driving jobs were less vulnerable to negative personal economic impacts of the pandemic than other occupations. In the pre-survey, 56% of participants increased the amount of time working, and only 25% reported decreased pay. This contradicts previous research reporting pay cuts and reduced hours due to COVID-19 across multiple industries, including the transportation industry. Fifth, drivers experienced decreases in morale as well as experienced heightened stress. Workers reported feeling more stressed than the pre-pandemic, and the addition of threats to personal safety, more stringent solitary policies, and depleted resources seem to contribute to this increased stress. Not to mention, it is unknown the extent that these restrictions may be impacting their well-being, or it may create a sharper divide between job levels in the industry. And finally, 6, there was an overall improved public perception of truck drivers. Even with increased stress and decreased morale, the public recognized the efforts of truck drivers, where the public was more appreciative of companies working continuously throughout the pandemic. This is a unique finding and is unknown if this positive sentiment will continue as COVID-19 impacts subside over time. Based on these takeaways, there is future research that can be done to expand upon these findings. It may be helpful to evaluate a national sample within the trucking industry that has a more balanced proportion of all employee types. Another place to expand upon is studying the new impacts of COVID-19 brought forward or examining how the pandemic may have exacerbated old issues in the trucking industry, such as the need for new technology, such as contactless delivery, changes to business models and operations, public perception of truck drivers, and how this will impact the ongoing issue of driver retention and shortages. Finally, it is unknown what will happen to employees who temporarily left the trucking industry, or if they will return or venture into new careers. Future research could shine a light on more broad workforce impacts. As the pandemic continues, it is unclear what the aftermath of COVID-19 will hold for the trucking industry and the country. The economy changed drastically in the span of months, affecting the daily productivity of trucking companies and the industry broadly. Some changes have been positive, such as e-commerce generated freight volumes, while other unpredictable factors like supply chain disruptions have led to setbacks. It is unknown what consequences of COVID-19 will linger in company operations and industry trends long after the pandemic is resolved. The trucking industry kept America running during an unprecedented time in history. One main takeaway from our talk today is that through pivoting, adapting, and the country's support, the trucking industry was able to survive COVID-19. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. My contact information, as well as our website, weaveNSF.com, is listed on here if you would like to learn more about our research projects.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, we'll do some virtual clapping. And Danielle is here with us to take questions. So we have 10 minutes allocated for questions. I do see a couple of questions in the chat box, so perhaps we'll start with those. I'll draw your attention to Kara Kogelman's first question. Or Kara, do you want to elaborate since you're here? Hello.
Oh no, I think she's already read them, so she's fine.
Yeah, so to address your first question, so I'm not sure about the difference between COVID rates of truck drivers to the national population. They, like I mentioned, the demographics make them more prone to getting COVID, but being in a truck has some benefits to them being able to isolate. And I think if I had to guess, I would assume it would be lower due to the company protocols that they put in place. But another thing in terms of retiring, we only talk to people currently in the workforce. We talked to some people who took temporary layoffs that came back and kind of expressed those. But I think anyone who there's kind of that rule of COVID that everything was expressed by 2 years. Is kind of the 2-year rule that I've been hearing for company businesses and things. So I think anybody who was thinking about retiring may have kind of expedited that process if they were already on their way out of the industry. But let's see here. I don't know about the labor laws, if that's going to change, but that's one thing that mentioned is that just with shortages, I mean, the truck drivers who are employed right now did fare better. Some talked about, the companies that we talked to were really employee focused. So, having benefits, making sure their drivers were employed, taking care of their families were in good shape. And a lot of people didn't express, besides being separated from other employees, didn't express much animosity about their company during the time of COVID. So I think that they need people to enter the industry. So hopefully that those changes do change and they allow the age to go down lower. But I do think, I'm not entirely positive about the exact wage value for each company, but I do think that companies, like I mentioned, it had kind of certain benefits that they put in place in order to make company employees feel safe and secure, and definitely let them take off time if that was something that was making them uncomfortable as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so feel free to drop a question in the chat if you haven't already, or you can use the raised hand button if you'd like to speak, or alternatively, if not, just go ahead and unmic yourself and jump in. I'll give folks a moment, and then if nobody raises their hand, I will ask a question. Danielle, when I think about, oh, no, wait. We have a question from Hannah.
So we talk to company employees, so I'm not sure if they know on an industry scale what is going to happen in terms of supply chains. I think we're already seeing kind of improvements as, a year has passed from March. And so I think that as long as, things, who knows what like upcoming problems with the Delta variant, what that will have on supply chain disruptions or things of that nature. But so not entirely sure about what the exact timeline would be of that. But that's something to look forward to in the future.
Okay, I'll jump in and ask a question, Danielle. So, as I think about the lessons coming out of the pandemic, I sometimes question if, what are the implications for us for the next pandemic, but also what are the implications from your research for the resiliency of the trucking sector for other types of crises, like climate disruptions and natural disasters and whatnot? Are there any specific lessons that you found from your research that you think would also be applicable to helping us think through the resiliency of the industry in that regard as well?
I think that in terms, thinking about climate and things like that, I think that one thing that really shone through is I think they were really employee focused. However, that doesn't really translate to thinking of broader problems across the country. I think that companies are willing to adapt in order to stay afloat and willing to make those changes. So I think that if they would have to pivot to different types of vehicles or making certain changes, I think that they are willing to do so. I think that this showed that they were able to pivot very quickly on their feet. And so I think that would be possible. By nature, though, with their job is operating a vehicle. So, that makes it a little bit more difficult for them just because they have those constraints versus to other companies who are able to work from home, which is reducing all those like carbon emissions by traveling and kind of like that. So, they are able to pivot to a certain extent, but by the nature of their job, it makes certain constraints a little bit difficult.
Okay, we still have just a couple more minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question who'd like to jump in?
Have any of you ever driven a heavy duty truck? I've had students who've had that pleasure, or bus drivers. Pretty tricky stuff. I think I would hit everything in my way.
I agree. Me as well. I don't think it's definitely a intense job, lots of fatigue. I don't know how if I could handle that, but yeah, definitely a lot of admiration for people who do.
So we do have papers on automated trucks, so that these people can sleep, they can perform other activities, that might be for their employer, calling, I don't know, people and taking care of, administrative tasks while in the vehicle, but it allows the vehicle to go much further without the hours of service constraints and things like that. So that's at my website in case anybody's interested. And yeah, people worry about the loss of jobs for truck drivers, but it won't be that fast. It'll probably be quite helpful since it is not a popular job.
Yeah, definitely.
I do have one more question. Did border issues come up at all in your research, particularly issues of trade getting across borders and what with the shifts and restrictions, particularly perhaps between the US, Mexico and US, Canada?
That wasn't something that came up a lot. It was more just like in general talking about delays. And I think it also depends on, what type of employee you're talking to. If you're talking to somebody like a driver, they might not know the intricacies of the reasons for the delays. So I don't know. Trade international was not something that came up as a big thing that we discussed. It was just more in general, things being pushed back, delayed, not being able, certain industries had to kind of halt for a couple months for various reasons.
And I have one last question. So I'm a transit equity guy, so this is all very new to me. So I'm sorry if this is a very dumb or unrelated question, but
No dumb questions.
are there any particular regulations that are in place for truckers that made life difficult for the industry to adapt during this crisis?
I think, hours of service is always a difficult regulation in the sense that they have to get things by a certain period of time. And so drivers are paid also while they're waiting at certain facilities. So with delays happening that eats up their time. And there are so many people, we talked about like e-commerce increasing, there's so many people, such a high demand that it was a really strenuous time. So I think that those kind of pressures, both from like a company standpoint and consumer demand standpoint, were making it difficult on them, and how they were actually, you can't go over your hours of service. And now they have electronic logs in the vehicles that, keep track of that. So there's no way to kind of fib getting around those regulations. And so, yeah, that was probably the biggest one that made it quite difficult.
Great, thank you so much. So if anyone has any further questions, you can reach out to Danielle via a direct chat. We do have to move on now to Natalia's presentation. Natalia joins us from TU Delft. Just give me 1 second to pull up the screen.
I will be presenting a paper that I co-authored with Dr. Nikhil Menon and Professor Fred Mannering. We'll be discussing work.
And it looks like we're just having some technical difficulties. My recording doesn't seem to load the video. Natalia, did you want to try and present from your computer?
Yes, I'm first going to try to, present the video. If that doesn't work, although it seems to be visible on my screen, I'm going to go live. So let's try.
And as we set up, Natalia is an assistant professor of transport and energy at Delft University of Technology, or TU Delft. Her research focuses on developing statistical and econometric models to study the adoption and usage patterns of new transportation systems, as well as related behavior and preferences. She holds a doctorate in civil engineering from the University of South Florida and completed her postdoctoral training at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me start my video. I'm assuming you can see my first slide.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
but we can't hear you, Natalia. How about delivering it live? So there's no audio, I'm afraid, Natalia.
You know what happens? It goes to my headphones. So let's do it live. Let's be adventurous. All right, I'm gonna share my presentation. Give me 1 minute. I'm gonna pull up my slides. Hello, my name is Natalia Barbour, and I will be presenting a paper that I co-authored with Dr. Nikhil Menon and Professor Fred Mannering. We'll be discussing work from home during COVID-19 and beyond. Let me introduce Jill and Jack. Jill and Jack were regular people traveling back and forth from work before the pandemic. They were going to their respective workplaces, and every day they left home to go to work, and then they returned back. In March 2020, COVID-19 disrupted our lives and their commutes. Many people were forced to start working from home. And they have been working from home for some time. And now that it's a possibility to return to some of the workplaces, these people are also faced with a choice. Do they go back to work, or they stay at home and work from home? And this is a different paradigm than all the work from home studies from the past. The reason for that is usually when we consider work from home, we assume that the telecommute is done by choice. Because of COVID, telecommuting had to begin by necessity. So a lot of people who have switched to work from home, they didn't do it out of free will. So then, once they had to experience this phenomena, they knew what it feels like, what it is to work from home, and then they'll be faced with a choice. Do they go back to work, or they stay home? Before we go into our results, we should probably ask ourselves this question: does even work from home belong to the transportation domain? Because we're not studying mobility. We're studying the propensity not to commute, not to travel. Because transportation sector emissions have grown so steadily for the last 3 decades, work from home could be a viable option to decrease these emissions and to relieve the transport system. And particularly in the context of COVID-19 pandemic and all the disruptions that have happened in our lives, it is a nice way to explore an alternative that will provide environmental benefits. So what have we seen so far around the globe? Have we seen any change? I'm going to be presenting a few set of pictures, and of course we can't contribute all the clean air to just commute that was prohibited during that time, but we can easily assume that it did play a role in clearing the air around us. So this is a view of Milan, Italy, on the left in January 2020, and same city on April 17th, a few weeks into lockdown. Here is India, same picture on 2 different times. On the right-hand side, it was after a 21-day nationwide lockdown. And lastly, Los Angeles in California. Again, same city, 2 different air quality types. So studying people's propensity not to travel is as important as studying their need to travel. And that is why we'll be focusing on work from home in this work. So what do we know so far? Let's compare Twitter and research. So 2 researchers during the initial months of the pandemic found that 73% of tweets had positive sentiments about work from home. Of course, we can go into the self-selection that there's a particular population on Twitter that's not representative. So, of course, after we account for that, we're not quite sure how people perceived work from home. On the other hand, 44% of workers from the Netherlands mobility panel who switched to work from home found that they work more hours and are holding 30% more meetings. So not so positive after all. When looking at different variables that play a role in that behavior, and particularly in the telecommute context, prior research found that variables like gender, income, education, children present, all had an impact on these behaviors. Furthermore, people who were highly educated and had high incomes and were white workers were more likely to shift to work from home and also maintain the employment after the pandemic. It was also found that lower wage workers were up to 3 times less likely to be able to work from home. It is in a way intuitive because a lot of lower wage jobs cannot be done from home. And those with a lower levels of education, who were younger and coming from ethnic minorities and immigrants, were also concentrated in occupations with tasks that were not easily done from home. So taking this background in consideration, we developed our studies. We're going to present 2 models. First model was estimated on people who did not work from home before COVID, but then they switched to work from home. And that model was a binary random parameters loaded model with heterogeneity in the mean of random parameters. Next model, it will be a conditional model. So the second model took the people who switched to work from home, and we studied whether they will be more or less likely to return to their workplaces. And again, we will take in consideration the heterogeneity in the mean of random parameters. So data collection. The data collection was in July and August of 2020, so in relatively early stages of the pandemic. And we included in our studies all the variables that were significant in prior studies, which is the social demographics, the employment status, the travel behavior, and for example, residential location. The data were collected via prime panels, and the first survey was a pilot survey. Then the final survey was modified and disseminated. The target population included US adults that were individuals above 18 years old. Here's the conceptual framework of the study. First, we had people who did not work from home, but switched to work from home, and we had 1,275 observations. That was after data cleaning. Next, we had the respondents who switched to work from home, and that were 367. And last model, we looked at these respondents and analyzed their responses in context of returning back to the workplace. And as you can see, around half the people wanted to return to their workplaces, indicated the willingness, and the other half wanted to work from home. In context of the estimation methods, we started with developing our model as a multinomial loaded model, and then we kept increasing the flexibility to capture the unobserved heterogeneity, and we ended up with the random parameters loaded model with heterogeneity in the means and variance of random parameters. We did test for the variance, but unfortunately we did not detect any. So the final model was the random parameters loaded model with heterogeneity in the mean of random parameters. So allowing for this heterogeneity in the means and variances of random parameters, it helped us to increase the depth of our analysis and also advance the standard approach in travel behavior field. We also compared the traditional fixed parameters models and random parameters using a likelihood ratio test. And in all of the models, we rejected the null hypothesis with over 99% confidence. And that indicated that the random parameters models were statistically superior. So we will be presenting only those. So here are two models. The first one, again, were on people who did not work from home but switched to work from home. And the second one was only estimated on respondents who switched to work from home. The blue indicates model on switching to work from home, and the dark orange on continuing to work from home after COVID-19 pandemic. So what did we find? Age played a role in the probabilities of that behavior that relates to work from home during and post-COVID. We found that older respondents, and those are about 50 years old, had a lower probability of starting to work from home once the pandemic started. Past research on this topic indicated that it could be due to the not very high confidence with technology needed to work from home. On the other hand, we found that younger respondents, and those who were below 30 years old, were more likely to continue to work at home once they made the switch. And that was indicated by the average marginal effect. This variable, however, was a random parameter, so it captured and observed heterogeneity across younger respondents. And that's where our heterogeneity in the means comes in, because we found that this group of the younger respondents was influenced by their country of origin. So respondents who indicated that they were not born in the US, and the presence of children in the household. And both of these variables increased the mean of the younger respondents' random parameter, which ultimately increased their likelihood to continue work from home. So to wrap up about this variable, if they were younger respondents who were immigrants with children, they had increased likelihood to work from home post-pandemic. Next, education. Just like in prior studies, education had a higher likelihood of shifting to work from home during the pandemic, particularly graduate education. And we also were able to capture unobserved heterogeneity in this parameter. And this group was influenced by the location where respondents lived. And in this case, it was large city. So they had a lower mean, making them less likely to shift to work from home during the pandemic. The graduate education indicator also had a lower probability to continue work from home past the pandemic. So highly educated people had a lower probability to work from home, and they were more likely to return to their workplaces. The presence of children, another very complex variable that we were able to capture, and the presence of children increased the likelihood of working from home during the pandemic. But there was also a substantial heterogeneity in this variable. The mean of this random parameter, which is presence of children, was influenced by two other variables, so college education and male indicator. And the direction of that influence was different. So people with children were influenced by college education that increased their mean and thus likelihood to work from home. However, if they were males, they had a lower mean, which decreased their probability to work from home, switch to work from home during the pandemic, because that's the blue model. The presence of children also was significant in the other conditional model, so model on continuing to work from home, and made respondents less likely to continue work from home after the pandemic. Next, income. Just as indicated by prior studies, respondents with low annual household income, and that was in our study below $25,000 had a lower probability to begin work from home after the pandemic started, which is very intuitive and very consistent with past work. However, once we accounted for the unobserved heterogeneity in a multivariate context, we found that these respondents, the low annual household income respondents, had a higher probability to continue work from home once they made the switch, which is not something we expected. Location. So every respondent indicated their location, rural area, small city, large city. And we found that respondents from rural areas and those who did not work from home had a lower probability to start work from home during the pandemic. However, once the respondents switched to work from home during the pandemic, and those respondents who lived in large cities were found to have higher probability to continue to work from home post-pandemic. So if you live in a large city and you switch to work from home, you will be more likely to continue work from home if you live in a large city, but less likely if you live in a small town. And lastly, people from different job sectors responded to that switch during the pandemic slightly different. And for example, respondents from administrative support or IT had a higher probability to begin work from home, and from marketing, lower probability. So these are a little bit different behaviors. However, once the people from all these three sectors that were statistically significant in our study made the switch during the pandemic, they had a lower probability to continue work from home, and they were more likely to return to their workplaces, which points towards work from home in the long term being something very difficult to achieve, because there's a strong pull in all these three sectors to return to their workplaces. Final remarks about our paper on shifting to work from home for those who didn't, and then returning to the workplaces. It's definitely not an easy proposition to have a long-lasting change. There's a strong force to return to workplace, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach in terms of encouraging different sectors and different groups to, for example, work from home and decrease their commutes. There's a considerable uncertainty about that behavior, about the transition from work from home during the pandemic into the post-pandemic world. And different groups of respondents behave differently. So in terms of policy, requiring location and group-specific policies could help to achieve desired outcome. And lastly, something that's been very interesting to study, because work from home in this case and telecommute were done rather by necessity and not by choice. Once people experience something, their attitudes and perceptions towards work from home can change. And with that, I would like to thank you. Here are some tables of the full models.
All righty, thank you so much, Natalia. So we have only 8 minutes for questions now. I see we have a couple of questions in the chat about control groups. Controlled variables. The first is from Robert Nolan, who asks, what about employers requiring workers to return to the office? Were you able to control for this?
We did not have this information in our survey, but indirectly we had the sector information. So we had the marketing, and we had, for example, healthcare and all the other sectors. So we did study different sectors, but not about the employer's preferences, unfortunately.
Thank you. And then another question from Hannah. Were you able to control for attitudes towards the pandemic, i.e. someone treating it with more caution, maybe more likely to work from home?
Yes, that's definitely, those are great questions. we did, again, when the survey was collected, we were not able to collect all the information that could impact that behavior. But that's definitely something that probably was captured in our more sophisticated statistical approach as unobserved heterogeneity. And if we did have that information, it could become statistically significant if we included it. But no, we did not add it to the survey.
And then I see another question. Hello, Natalia. Did your model have any employer side preferences in the type of job information, including things like job location policies?
Yes, thank you. No, we did not have employer side. So to tell you more about this survey, it was a stated preference survey where people were asked whether they switched to work from home and then whether they will return to workplace or they will continue to work from home. So those were our questions that we used for the dependent variable. And we only considered the employee's side, not the employer's side. And unfortunately, that's one of the limitations of our study, that we could not match the supply and demand, because I completely understand that, for example, the workers who say, oh, I want to work from home, their employers may not allow for that. But our question was faced in a way of, are you going to return to work from home? So I'm not sure how the respondents actually answered that question, but I would assume that if they said that they're going to work from home, they've already kind of had an idea whether then their employers would want them to return or they would have the flexibility to remain at home.
I just want to jump in with a quick question. I thought the results of your second model were really fascinating about low-income workers, and the fact that in the second step, if I recall correctly, low-income workers were more likely to want to continue working from home after controlling for the fact that they're less represented in working from home. That's really interesting. Do you have any thoughts on why that is?
Yes, thank you for the question. So that was also interesting for us because all the studies that were done prior to, and even in our keynote an hour ago, it's that increased relationship to income. But once we saw the switch and the people, and I assume that they could be even part-time workers or even, even all the jobs that could be performed from home. So not all the service work, but all the other jobs. Those people were more likely to continue to work from home, which provides extreme opportunity for fighting equity because of the transportation. The low workers have lower access to jobs. So possibly maybe even creating the lower income jobs that could be done remotely could solve at least a fraction of the problems.
I mean, certainly for a worker who, if it's their only job, only being on 25 grand a year, taking that commute costs and gas costs out of the equation is obviously going to be helpful. So that's really interesting. I see a couple of other comments about age and why is it that older workers might enjoy going to the office more. I don't know if you have any responses to those.
Because I was just reading a question from Robert Noland in order. So let me answer this one. First, it's all days a week. It's not 2-3 days a week. It was full-time work from home. That's how we coded that variable. And may you repeat the question that you just asked, please?
Do you have a response to, Kara has some comments on older workers perhaps wanting to return to the office more because they're the ones who have the private offices, among a few other considerations.
Right, we were wondering about that. So in the first model, when we were seeing who's going to switch to work from home, older workers actually were less likely to switch to work from home. So those were the workers who, because they have those huge private offices, so COVID was never a concern, and they have the means to travel to those huge offices. But then the younger counterparts were more likely to actually stay at home, which makes intuitive sense. And again, it could be as in that's were similar thoughts to Professor Mamasani, the tech savviness. And for example, how, and we also did not capture this, some work looks at the propensity to work from home as, you know, feeling productive, and how is your productivity home versus workplace. So maybe these people are so conditioned to be productive in the workplaces that they don't achieve the same productivity at home. But that's just speculation. Maybe someone can chime in if you know of some good study. No, okay.
I just know my husband and me, and he's 2 years older, but he loves staying at home because, you know, he doesn't have to shave, maybe, although he still does. And yeah, he likes to watch our 17-year-olds, and I find it way too chaotic. I can focus much better here. So he just doesn't like his job as much as I like my job. He's a lawyer.
Makes sense. Thank you for sharing. And I see one question. I know I'm out of time. I'm wondering whether this research is also relevant to urban sprawl. And we did capture residence location, and that was interesting. Once the people switched to work from home, and then we looked at what influences whether they return back. We looked at that people who lived in larger cities are less likely to go back to work, and that means remaining work from home, and that could capture their being afraid of COVID. But the people who lived in small towns, that's the group who was more likely to return to their workplaces even after switching to work from home. So there's definitely some, and there's prior work on residential location and work from home. So we were looking for justification there.
We are out of time, but I do have one quick question, and that is, this might be asking too much, but can you read the tea leaves from your data and tell us what are the implications for public transit of some of your findings? Was there a difference in prior mode use and openness to working from home, or?
That's actually my idea for the next paper, to analyze the switch in context of the prior mode. I did not include it in this research. However, I did some basic modeling and I was getting some cool things, so maybe I'll get back to it. I do not want to speculate too much, but in my very preliminary, just having fun and seeing if it runs, I saw that the biggest switch was, of course, from the car travel, but also the biggest pull back. So when you were commuting by car, even if you stopped commuting, you will still continue to commute by car as opposed to other modes. But again, it's not published. It's just me playing with the data.
Great. Well, I'll be looking forward to seeing that work as well. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much.
Up next, we have Hannah Hook, who will be joining us from the Ghent University, where Hannah is a doctoral researcher aiming to inform travel satisfaction and subjective well-being. Her research focuses include understanding the positive utility of and satisfaction with daily travel by investigating undirected travel behavior. By understanding daily travel preferences and attitudes and their connection to well-being and associated with different life domains, she hopes to identify opportunities for encouraging sustainable, healthy travel and improving the social equity of transportation. And Hannah, would you like to add anything to that?
Nope, I think you got it all. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, just get your presentation loaded.
So normally we would have her present directly, but she is not in a great internet situation today. So she's gonna be here though to take questions, which is fantastic. Thank you, Hannah.
And as before, just give me a thumbs up that the sound is working.
Hello, I'm Hannah Hook from Ghent University in Belgium, and today I will talk about some research that was completed just after the first COVID lockdown regarding how travel behavior changed from a life-oriented perspective in Belgium. Through a life-oriented approach, this research considers the COVID-19 pandemic to be a life event with the ability to affect different life domains. So this research focuses on 4 life domains, which are work, study, shopping, social activity, and free time, and 4 travel modes: walking, cycling, car use, and public transit. The life-oriented approach follows a recent trend in travel behavior research that has turned away from objective approaches, for instance, simplest trip chaining, or activity-based approaches, toward more holistic measurements. The life-oriented approach evaluates travel behavior that accounts for the fact that it is inherently connected to life events and life choices in the short term, in the long term, and over the life course. It offers a more complete understanding of individual travel behavior so that both internal and external factors can be accounted for. Internals, for example, would include individual preferences, attitudes, or life situation. And then external factors would include, for example, the built environment or workplace changes, and in this case, the global pandemic. Our 4 life domains were chosen due to their connection to travel behavior. So first of all, the work and study life domain is inherently connected to travel through the commute, and that makes up approximately 30% of total trips in most Western countries. And it's often mandatory and fixed regarding time and location, which in turn often fixes the modal choice. So commuting is often seen as a burden, and it's many times chosen according to whether it's compensated by the labor or the housing market. And the psychological detriment and stress of commuting can influence both travel behavior and the work-study life domain. The pandemic may have influenced travel behavior related to this life domain through teleworking. So teleworking is seen as a strategy to reduce the detriments of commuting, and the notable increase in teleworking during the COVID pandemic has caused an obvious change in both commuting behavior and the work-study life domain. Our second life domain is the shopping life domain, and this is related to travel behavior in that it can be mode dependent. For example, purchases might be too heavy or too large to carry on foot or by bicycle, therefore relying on the car, or maybe there are more trips taken, like everyday trips to the supermarket, in order to accommodate walking or cycling. And shopping is similarly linked to the pandemic through an increase in online shopping, which has been found to impact travel behavior in 4 unique ways. So first, there's substitution, which would be replacing shopping trips with online shopping. There's complementarity, which is where individuals partake in both online and traditional shopping with an increase in total shopping trips. Modification, where shopping trips change due to the adoption of online shopping. And finally, neutrality or no change. Our last 2 life domains are social activity and free time, and they have further connections to travel behavior with overlapping implications. For example, activities done during free time are often linked to other people. Social networks have been found to influence travel itself through travel companions, as well as the activities to which a person must travel. So for example, talking to other people on public transit can improve satisfaction with public transit trips. And then also, approximately half of leisure trips are taken by non-preferred modes, and this is often because they are taken with other people. And certainly the restrictions from the COVID lockdown have changed the way that individuals socialize, as well as the amount of free time that's available to them and the ways that they can use it. Therefore, their travel behavior is expected to change alongside these life domain changes. Aside of the specific life domains, the pandemic has changed travel behavior in a number of specific ways. There was a decrease in out-of-home activities seen, and this has led to a decrease in overall travel demand in both distance and number of trips. Individuals who have multiple modes available to them may prefer to use private modes instead of public modes to avoid infection risk, though travel inequity, on the other hand, may have increased for those who only have the option to take public modes. And public mode availability in some places may have decreased due to social distancing regulations. Undirected trips, such as taking a walk, a bicycle ride, or a joyride by car, might have increased due to the physical activity and mental health benefits. For us in Belgium, the lockdown was especially good for investigating these travel behavior changes because the regulations were quite stringent compared to most of the EU due to high population density in Belgium and a high infection rate. So we saw schools, universities, and all non-essential stores closed. All gatherings and meetings were prohibited. Stores that did remain open were shopping markets, pharmacies, news agents, and banks, and they all had capacity and distance restrictions as well as time limit durations restrictions. Teleworking was mandatory for all jobs for which it was possible. Stopping in parks was forbidden, though they remained open for movement through, such as walking or jogging. Movement outside the home with a maximum of 2 people was permitted, but only if the 2 people lived together. And social distancing of at least 1.5 meters was required in both outside and public inside spaces. And regarding the public transit systems, they remained operational, but they were reserved for those without travel alternatives, and the service was reduced by 14% for buses and by 10% for trams. So understanding how travel behavior can relate to these different life domains is interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, it can help us to identify whether a switch from motorized to active modes can be associated with certain life domains, which could encourage improvements in physical and mental health and well-being, and this is especially true during times of lockdown. It can help us anticipate how people might travel after the pandemic, because many of the changes that we have seen are expected to continue after a return to normal. It can inform policy to encourage healthy and sustainable, or in other words, active mode use. And understanding which life domains are associated with which travel modes can be informative to a policy that aims to encourage individuals to switch from motorized modes to active modes. And finally, it can allow us to plan for future crises, though hopefully we don't have to think about that anytime in the near future. So by regarding the COVID-19 pandemic as an important life event with the ability to change travel behavior, a life-oriented approach will explore whether changes in activity participation in these different life domains affect changes in travel behavior. This research will specifically investigate if certain activity participation in the work, study, shopping, social contact, and free time life domains is associated with certain travel modes regarding walking, cycling, car, and public transit use. And this can help us determine whether lockdown stimulates a shift from motorized to active mode use, whether it stimulates a shift from public to private mode use, and whether these changes are dependent on the life domain with which they are associated. Regarding our methodology, we had an online survey open and circulated for 2 weeks during the first Belgian lockdown period from the 20th of April to the 4th of May. Facebook community groups were targeted in 41 municipalities in the Ghent and Antwerp regions, and this was in order to use some spatial data in order to look at the difference in residential location. And we had 854 respondents that were usable for this study. The address data was geocoded and analyzed for level of urbanization based on spatial variables, including transit density, intersection density, residential density, and land use mix. This example is not from this study, but it uses the same methodology as a previous study done by the International Physical Activity and the Environment Network. These 4 scores were Z-scored per methodology of walkability and regional accessibility indexing, and incorporates Cervero's 5Ds as well. The link between travel and the built environment can affect access to travel modes, distance, time, traffic congestion, and therefore the quality of urban design can differ among different residential densities. For example, if a cycle highway creates a reduction in commute time for a substantial number of people, this can affect travel behavior in city areas. And residential characteristics of proximity to businesses, living outside of a cul-de-sac, the aesthetics of the neighborhood, all of that stimulates undirected travel trips. So the idea here was that individuals in varying levels of urbanization, like rural versus urban, might experience differences in travel behavior regarding different life domains. For example, someone might live in a rural area because they enjoy being able to go for long walks or for long bike rides. So as their free time changed, they might partake in this kind of undirected travel more often. However, even though we put some time into figuring out the differences among urban densities, the results did not indicate that there was a distinct difference, so I won't go into it too much during this talk. Regarding further methodology, first I'll discuss the average responses of the key variables. Then I will discuss the ANOVA means comparison tests that evaluated changes in the use of different modes among individuals who reported a change in each of the life domains and those who did not. After that, ordinary least squares regression evaluates the relationship between the 4 life domains and the 4 travel modes. And finally, though it was not the primary focus of this study, I will discuss some interesting findings regarding the covariates. So average pre-lockdown mode use saw that before the lockdown, the average car use was the highest among all the modes. So this was ranging from never to always using each of these different modes, and then these scores were averaged. So car use was the highest at that 3.32, followed by cycling and walking, and public transit use was the lowest. So cycling and walking fell in the middle, but more people slightly reported cycling more often than walking. However, as we know, lockdown changed daily travel mode use, so our participants reported walking much more on average and cycling more, but on the other hand, they reported using public transportation less and driving much less. And regarding life domain changes, as expected, we saw a high average change across all the different life domains, with social contact being the most changed, followed by free time and shopping. The work and study life domain did see still quite high average change, but they saw the least change of all 4 of the life domains. So now I will talk about the ANOVA results among those who reported that each life domain was affected by the lockdown and those who reported that it was not, and then look at each different mode. So in the work study life domain, both the affected and unaffected groups walked more and used the car less, but the affected group saw even stronger effects. The affected group increased cycling, while the unaffected cycled slightly less. And then, as denoted by these empty bars in public transit, changes in public transit use were non-significant. This suggests that the respondents whose work and study life domain was affected by the lockdown were walking and cycling substantially more, and then using the car substantially less than those with this life domain unaffected, and that perhaps cycling compensated for some changes in work study time. After that, we'll look at the shopping results. So there was not a significant change seen in either the walking or cycling for affected and unaffected groups. Both the affected and unaffected groups used the car and public transit less, but the affected group saw even stronger effects. And these results suggest that respondents whose shopping life domain was affected were using the car and public transit substantially less than those with this life domain unaffected, and that some shopping trips requiring the car or public transit were possibly discontinued. And then moving on to social contact, the ANOVA results saw that there was no significant change in walking. Both the unaffected and affected groups used the car and public transit less, but the affected group saw even stronger effects. And the affected group increased their cycling, while the unaffected cycled slightly less. And these findings suggest that some social trips requiring the car or public transit maybe were discontinued, and perhaps cycling compensated for some of the loss in social contact. And finally, regarding free time, we saw no significant change in walking, cycling, or car use. Both the affected and unaffected groups, however, used public transit less, but the affected group saw even stronger effects. So this suggests that perhaps some free time activities requiring public transit may have been discontinued. And then to take this one step further, the relationships between the 4 life domains and the 4 travel modes were examined using ordinary least squares regression. So we saw significant findings in the work and study life domain with, as change increased in this domain, there was more walking and less car use. So this could either indicate that perhaps individuals experience some compensatory behavior from work time to walking time, or a more complementary relationship. Perhaps those working from home wanted to get out of the house and exercise or clear their head. And it's assumed that the increased walking and cycling trips are probably undirected travel trips, since the number of out-of-home activities significantly was reduced. Next, in both the shopping and the free time life domains, with increasing change, less public transit use was seen. This observation could simply reflect the overall reduction in public transit use in general due to the lockdown regulations and the low means of respondents' public transit use prior to lockdown. And this illustrates that this behavior probably just continued during the lockdown. And then in the social contact domain, with increasing change, more cycling and less car use was seen. So this result indicates, probably unsurprisingly, that car trips reduced alongside a reduction in options for social activity, but it also suggests that perhaps individuals experience some compensatory behavior from social time to cycling time. And further regression results were seen within the covariates that we controlled for, and though they are not directly related to the research questions, they're still noteworthy. So regarding age, as age increased, car use significantly decreased, and this could indicate that older groups are more likely to hold flexible teleworkable jobs. And also among this group, as age increased, walking significantly decreased, which could indicate that maybe there was greater caution in regard to the pandemic itself among older individuals. Next, those who were employed or studying were more likely to increase their car and public transit use. So this could indicate that those still traveling to work normally during the lockdown may have taken advantage of decreased levels of traffic and congestion as roads and trains or buses were less occupied. So in sum, and in agreement with many other lockdown travel behavior studies, a reduction in motorized modes and an increase in active modes across the board was seen. Those who reported a change in their work-study life domain, for instance, those who maybe decreased their time working or made a change to teleworking, they were more likely to increase their walking. And those who remained in their normal work-school routines were likely to increase their use of motorized modes, which could be explained by a latent demand where they were taking advantage of these modes, because this was across the board for both public and private motorized modes. Maybe they were taking advantage of these modes during times with less traffic congestion. And finally, compensation for changed social contact with cycling was seen. So this, alongside the compensation for work study time with walking, could be useful for those interested in promoting active travel for health or sustainability purposes and for anticipating travel behavior post-pandemic. Here, I will quickly acknowledge my co-authors, Jonas de Vos, Veronique van Acker, and Frank Witlox. And thank you so much for your attention. I will leave you with my contact information here. Hello, I'm Hannah.
Okay, everyone, we will turn to, sorry, one sec, okay. We will turn to questions, Q&A. If anyone has any questions, feel free to jump in. You can drop them in the chat, or you are welcome to use the raised hand button at the bottom of your screen. And if not, I will go ahead and jump in. Hannah, do you have a sense at all about the role of bicycling increasing in social contact? To what extent that's just a function of the availability of infrastructure versus, say, that bicycling was just one of the few things we could do with our friends that was allowed? Or
Yeah, I think that that probably played a large part in it. We saw in some other research that has come out of this same data set, we saw that there was a lot of these undirected travel trips being taken. So walking, cycling, jogging, joyriding by car without a destination, just because what else are you going to do? You can't just sit around your house all day. And then also, even though technically we weren't supposed to be meeting any friends outside or doing anything, we were supposed to be just with the people under our same roof. I think a lot of people were taking advantage of those undirected trips as a chance to go, cycle with a friend, go on a walk with a friend. And I guess, the cycling was seen as the most significant. So that I would assume that has a lot to do with it.
We'll open the floor up if anyone else would like to jump in and add some questions. So I'm going to, oh, was it someone else? I was just gonna also put you on the spot and ask the same question I asked before. Are there any implications from your research for what post-COVID mobility may look like?
So I think the biggest, so there are two big points that I think about after looking through all this. And first is travel equity or travel inequity that has just been exacerbated by the pandemic. So hopefully realizing that there are a lot of people who couldn't switch modes. They still had to go to work. They still had to take public modes, all of these things. Hopefully we can see some infrastructure changes that maybe try to accommodate these people. And then the other side of that is teleworking. So as employers start to hopefully make more flexible teleworking schedules and allow their, as we've talked about in this group already, allow people to start working from home maybe more often. We saw some compensation for a reduction in directed trips with undirected trips. So if I'm not sure exactly how you would do it, but maybe some creative ways to incentivize their employees, even though you're working from home, if you go take a walk on your lunch break or go cycling on your lunch break, there's maybe, clubs you can join or incentives that you can do that get people more active and out and healthy maybe.
Right, I would certainly agree. Anyone else have any questions or comments for Hannah? Okay, I'll go again. What do you think are, if any, the big implications for our theories of travel behavior coming out of your work and some of the work that you're seeing around COVID?
So this isn't directly related to this output, but a different research output with the same data set. So I was looking into satisfaction with these undirected trips, and the undirected travel trips that we saw during the pandemic as maybe compensation for not being able to socialize or compensation for not having anything else to do. Satisfaction with these trips is significantly higher than for the commute that we've seen in previous research or for shopping trips or anything like that. And they're also significantly longer. I think the average commute is 28 minutes in Belgium, and these were on average 70 to 90 minutes long, something like that. So active undirected travel trips are just really helping people. And I'm not sure what that means, but as a strategy to overcome maybe the physical and mental detriments of being stuck at home, these active trips have replaced a lot of other things.
Great, thank you. Okay, seeing as there are no more questions, if anyone has any additional questions come to mind, you can direct message Hannah using the chat box. Hannah, thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt.
And coming up next, we have Qian He. Qian is, give me 1 second to pull up your bio. Qian is an instructor and PhD candidate in urban planning and public policy at the University of Texas at Arlington. Qian's research and publications have focused on environmental equity through aspects of public transit, neighborhood safety, and public health. Qian is particularly interested in examining how urban planning policies shape our community environment and how they affect the disparity in public health hazards. Her dissertation focuses on the social determinants of mental health in the context of the urban built environment. And I'll just add, she is a lovely colleague and co-author to work with. And with that, Qian, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Matt, for introducing me and for your note. I will start by sharing my screen, and I'll appreciate if y'all can let me know if you're able to see my screen. Okay.
Perfect, we see it.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and sharing this time with us. I will be presenting the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on U.S. transit riders who left and who was left behind. And this is research in collaboration with Dr. Alex Karner, Dr. Dana Rowangould, Dr. Matthew Palm, and Seth Larue. And it's my pleasure to be sharing this on behalf of the team. And it's very nice to have y'all here with us. I'll start by the introduction and background and then jump into the questions and methodology, and then I will be talking about the findings and discussions. Starting from the March 2020, the global pandemic of COVID-19 has decimated the public transit in the United States and larger in the world. We see the drop in US transit ridership due to the COVID-19, which is a huge impact. In the second quarter of 2020, we experienced an 85% drop on subway, light rail, and commuter rail ridership. And meanwhile, we see over 2/4 of drop in our bus ridership across the country. Services were cut as a consequence of this huge drop in ridership and of the lower revenue, and also the higher maintenance of the transit agencies because of the precautions of maintaining the sanity of the buses and services, transit facilities. As a consequence, the service dropped and then decreased at a significant amount. But people are adapting to the pandemic at different scales of ability, and we have essential riders who are still relying on transit to fulfill their daily needs. And what happened to them? So with a look in the literature, we know that transportation systems provide essential links between people and opportunities that they value, capturing the concept of accessibility. And accessibility is largely shaped by built environment, and we have a vast body of literature talking about that. But what we have been less discussed is how that experience vary on personal basis across the groups or shaped by social factors, for example, the presence of law enforcement, the perception of safety or risk on transit, and especially on social minority groups and social vulnerability groups. And the concept of transportation equity lens highlights the inequities in accessibility across the population groups and space. In the mobility justice perspective, from the humanities scholars and Black, Indigenous, and people of color transportation professionals emphasize examining broader and multi-scalar set of considerations to achieve justice, including elevating the lived experience of BIPOC communities and individuals. And again, personal accessibility is experienced very differently on individual characteristics and lived experiences. The actual perceived safety that stand out most in the COVID-19 pandemic on public transit use is an example of how identity intersect with accessibility and safety concerns posed by law enforcement, crime, harassment, and how that overlay with the races, ethnicity, gender presentation, disability, and immigration status, etc. We have seen some researchers examined the transit ridership decline during COVID-19 pandemic, and we found that they're less pronounced in areas where with a higher share of essential workers, with lower income household, people of color, and women. And we see different types of transit riders affected differently, especially choice riders have alternative choices for personal mobility. In the setting of COVID-19 pandemic, we assume that they will have a larger set of choices for personal mobility. Meanwhile, transit reliant, or as we frame essential riders, rely on transit for their day-to-day needs, such as jobs, schools, food, social services, recreation, medical care, and social connections. And this can include those who, with access to fewer or no alternative options, such as cannot obtain a driver's license because of their race and immigration status, where they are facing prohibitive expense for driving on their own. This includes a group that rely on transit, as previously called by literature the captive rider, but we believe that essential rider would be a more inclusive term, capturing those who rely on it, like out of choice or not out of choice, essentially. So little is known in the literature about why travel adaptations to pandemic differ among and between different types of riders, and what are the impacts on the pandemic on those riders because of the reduced mobility option on transit. So starting by a research question, we have three primary quests. The first one is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected transit use among different types of transit riders? And our second question is, among those riders who have reduced or stopped transit use, how do the reasons for stopping or reducing differ among different type of riders? And again, for the same group who reduce or stop transit use, how does the difficulty accessing essential destinations in life, such as work, grocery, healthcare, pharmacy, family care, and childcare, possessed by the reduction in transit use, vary across these different types of riders? We conducted a national survey in the United States starting from fall 2020, specifically from July to November. And we chose the riders who rode at least once per week or per part of all 2020 as our qualifiers. And the survey was distributed in English and Spanish online. Majority of the responses actually came out from the Facebook ads and transit-related Reddit groups, but we also did share the links that people can share with other people that they know were advocacy group in transit. Out of the survey, we were able to find 898 samples, and from those, 500 were useful in our final analysis. So we asked survey questions about travel behavior before and during the pandemic. That includes the transit mode, frequency of transit trips, and self-reported change in transit use. We also asked about the individual and household characteristics, including race, ethnicity, vehicle ownership, monthly income, disability status, age, driver's license, and residential location. We again asked for the attitudes about public transit and COVID-19, including reliance on transit to meet their daily needs and their concerns and their thoughts on that. For those who did reduce transit use, we added a filter to ask them the reasons for reducing transit risk, and then we provided a series of reasons that includes their concern on COVID-19 risk, their concern on the change of service, the cost of expense, the presence of law enforcement, or the potential risk of harassment, etc. And we also asked about those who reduce transit use. What are the impacts of this reduction on accessing essential destinations in life? So to process the data and validate the data we have, we compare our filter sample to the 2017 National Household Travel Survey respondents. We found out that our sample is relatively consistent, and despite for the skewness towards younger riders, middle income, white male, and those who do not have vehicle access. And our samples may also overrepresent respondents with internet access at home or on mobile devices, and underrepresent those transit riders without internet access due to the nature of online survey. So We set two analytical method approach to analyze our results. So for the first set, we were looking at who stands out in the comparative questions, asking, who are getting impacted more significantly due to the reduction in transit, and who are more concerned about specific factors in their decision in reducing or stopping transit use. And then we use the Witlox and Whitney test to test that result. And for the second set, we conducted negative binomial model and logistic model as multivariate modeling. The purpose is to isolate the specific factors while controlling for all the others. For the first group of finding, we see that certain groups of people are less likely to reduce and stop transit use. And those include people who do not have driver's license, without access to vehicle, living under double poverty line, and those are Hispanic or Latinx. And we also find that the difficulty accessing essential destination in life, including work, grocery, healthcare, pharmacy, family care, and childcare, possessed by the reduction of transit use, vary significantly across different types of riders for those who did reduce, and that include Hispanic and Latinx, people without driver's license, people living with or under double poverty line. They experience disproportionately greater difficulty in accessing essential destinations than their counterparts. And those are results from the Witlox and Whitney tests. And additionally, we find that among those riders who did reduce or stop transit use, the reasons for stopping or reducing transit use saw significant differences, especially among Hispanic Latinx riders versus the white counterparts, where the former group expressed greater concern towards all the reasons cited on the board in our survey, and that includes no longer needing to go to the destination, concern over the COVID-19 exposure on transit, service change, expensive transit trip, moving, harassment on transit use, and interaction with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is ICE. And looking at the findings from our multivariate models, we see from our negative binomial model that their transit riders in the following categories are more likely to ride transit during the pandemic after we control for all other factors. And that includes those people who do not have access to vehicle, who report relying on transit for their daily needs, Hispanic and Latinx riders, female, and those who live under the double poverty line. And again, from the results of our logistic model on the effect of transit reduction on their ability to reach essential destinations during the pandemic, we found that people who rely on transit to meet their needs and vulnerable populations, including Hispanic, Latinx, female, and low-income riders, are more likely to report greater difficulties. We conducted another set of logistic model testing the reasons for reducing transit use and how that differ among groups after we control for all the factors. And we find that Hispanic and Latinx riders are less likely to cite a change in needing to travel to the same destinations and more likely to cite a move, a change in transit service, the cost of riding transit, and concerns about harassment interactions with police or ICE on transit. And we tested for police and ICE specifically, both included in our model. Female responses are more likely to cite concerns about harassment as a reason for reducing transit use. This may be due to the fact that during the pandemic, there are less riders on board, which may create a higher perceived rates when they're riding transit. And transit riders in poverty are more likely to cite the risk of contracting COVID-19 and a move, while those whose incomes were reduced are more likely to cite a change in transit service, the cost of using transit, and concerns about harassment while using transit. To sum up our findings in this part, reduction in transit use disproportionately affect the ability of vulnerable groups to access essential destinations. Continued transit service costs will dramatically affect essential transit riders' daily lives, according to the results, particularly concerning the ongoing transit funding crisis, which is posing additional hardship on transit operation. And from our open-ended transit prompts on how a loss of transit service would affect their quality of life, we see respondents put, I will be 100% trapped without the transit access, noting that it will be difficult or impossible to get to work and other important destinations as shown in our model. And we also have another respondent said that transit is my lifeline to appointments and getting around. And we also see the challenges associated with alternative to transit in our open-ended survey respondents. And that includes long walking distances, spending money on rides, and obtaining rides from others. Our findings overall are consistent with prior literature on essential riders independent of the pandemic impact. Reducing or ceasing public transit use is not an option for all types of riders. Demonstrate the dramatically different effects of COVID-19 pandemic on the travel behavior across different groups in our essential rider in America. And some of those findings echo excellent findings in the literature, such as the differential experiences of harassment and threat faced by women and people of color while traveling in public space. And these differences we see even more during the setting of pandemic. And the effect of service change are different on different rider groups. And as of early 2021, Congress has responded and continues to respond to this fiscal crisis with influxes on recovery funding. Saving transit is now or never. However, short-term fundings, injections, and survey changes do not address long-term underinvestment in transit and that essential transit riders. We have to save transit for those who depend on it most, who use it most, and that is most important for their life quality if we want to save transit overall. The pandemic highlighted differences in the ways that different riders adapt to major disruptions, as well as disparities in the impact they experience. And it also provides us with an opportunity to revisit the way that we have been funding our transit in the long run so that we can strengthen the services for those who need it most. Developing alternative transit funding models to strengthen transit service for essential transit riders who rely on it most in the short and long-term aftermath of pandemic is necessary. And we welcome to know you more about our study. It is undergoing peer review for a journal, and a preprint of version is available with a link that I'll be sharing in the chat window later. I also welcome you to contact me. I'm posting my email address and Twitter connect here, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Qian. So as a co-author on this paper, it feels a bit like inside baseball to throw the questions at you. So instead, I'm going to ask if anyone else would like to go first before I jump in and offer some additional thoughts. Does anyone have any questions? And John Niles has a couple of interesting comments in the chat, Qian, if you want to.
Yeah, thank you, John. If you want to jump in and elaborate on it more, you're welcome to do so. I see we still have some time left. So I see John said that my understanding is that U.S. federal government in 3 relief actions signed by 2 presidents has distributed enough money to public transit agencies to cover local revenue losses and extra costs. Amount of money provided by the Fed is $69 billion. Ratio of this federal incremental money is 15.44 for each boarding in 2020 report to NTD. I hope somebody in academic transit research will examine impacts. That's a very interesting comment here. And we do see the importance of having studies from the federal government and local government on the transit operation is important and absolutely is a necessity. And yeah, it would be very interesting to look at the impact in our research for sure. Matt, if you want to add anything to that, you're welcome to do that too.
I see John is unmuted. Do you have any other thoughts? Anything you'd like to add?
Well, the follow-up there is the comment was made at the end of the presentation, the summary comment, there's underinvestment in public transit in the US. I just think that can be challenged. I mean, certainly there have to be upper limits on public investment in particular services that are heavily subsidized and operate at very high costs. A lot depends on what the definition of public transit you want to use. I'm not sure that taxi cab script has been used often enough in these situations where ridership is dropped off. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot more flexibility in giving rides to vulnerable populations than just saying we've got to keep doing transit the way we've always done it. This is an opinion here, but I think a close look at how much the investment in public transit has really been massive in the United States and continues to be. We're really throwing a lot of money at that. I'm speaking from the point of view of Seattle, which has, you know, a very high investment on a world scale in transit, and I'm just wondering what the upper limits are. Thank you.
I'll go ahead and jump in and respond. I think, at least in my mind, it's perhaps not so much under investment in transit, but under investment in the right kind of transit. So you think about,
Roger.
Yeah, like the scholarship, particularly Taylor and Morris, who wrote this paper, say, you know, pointing to the fact that a lot of times money for new light rail systems would come at the expense of bus service. And there's now some research that's been coming out over time that's saying that, you know, it hurts the overall system to be gutting the bus service, and that maintaining quality bus service is you know, really important to maintaining an effective transit system that has a good solid ridership. And, you know, I guess to riff a tad, I know because of another project, yeah, light rail revenue miles have gone up something like 45% in the last decade, or from 2008 to 2018. But if you look at the National Transit Database, you separate out the different types of bus service they measure, standard bus service has gone down by about 1% around that same period. And so I think and then COVID-19 hits, and as Qian's paper shows, it's the folks who were using the regular bus service who are still using transit, and all those light rail systems that were serving a lot of those you know, creative class workers in downtown cores of places like Seattle. Those are the very same folks who now we've lost to telecommuting, who are now switching to other modes. And so it might be a question of, what does it take to reprioritize investments into the essential riders, because that's where the stable ridership is. At least that's my opinion, coming out of COVID-19.
I think it's a good topic for research. Thank you. I agree with that opinion.
And Qian, do you have any more comments or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you summed it perfectly. Thank you, Matt. I also, and thank you, John, as well. Very insightful comment, and we really appreciate that. I also see a comment from Wei saying that relief actions issued by the US government can also cause certain financial deficit and inflation, which can possibly cause public transit pricing costs to go up. Wei, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit, and then so that we can address it?
Yeah, sure. Because previously John also mentioned that because the US government, they issued the relief actions, which signed by 2 presidents, has distributed enough money to the public, which can cover the local revenue losses and extra costs. So from my opinion, that means even if the money can cover the costs or maybe the revenue losses, but because the printing money can cause the inflation, so that the financial deficit can also offset the impact of can offset the positive impact of the printing money. So finally, the eventual result will be similar to the pre-pandemic situation. So even if the money will be distributed to the people or local institutions, but finally, the public transit price will very possibly remain the same, because inflation caused the price to go up, people pay more, and just like, you know, it's like a equal relationship. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei, for sharing that.
Are there any other questions or comments from anyone else in the group?
And thank you, Robert, for sharing your comment as well. If you want to elaborate on that, you're welcome to do that as well, to jump in the conversation.
I have a kind of question. Could you talk about maybe some community-based strategies to ensure that the funds that are being allocated are actually effectively helping vulnerable populations reach their destinations. For example, like sometimes a new light rail stop is put in and it's in the city center and it's really nice, but it's not actually helping anyone get to work. Like, how do you speak with the communities about where the money needs to go?
Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, I mean, one of the ideas that's sort of popular in parts of the US that some folks I'm sure you might be familiar with is bringing an element of participatory budgeting into local transportation planning. There's been some research on that and the potential for that. I mean, but in terms of getting agencies to shift where they invest and how they invest and where money goes, I mean, you could write a whole book on how we do that better. Hey, one of the things that, I mean, just, you know, getting MPOs, whether it's, you know, something electoral like Portland Metro or something where folks are appointed like the MTC in the Bay Area is a lot of work. And there have been some interesting examples of coalitions of advocates who have won important concessions by engaging in that project. So one of the most famous ones is the Six Winds Coalition. I think it was the Six Winds Network, which was a group of Bay Area social justice advocates, transit advocates, community groups that were pushing the Metropolitan Transportation Commission to adopt an alternative regional transportation plan. And what they did is they managed to get access to MTC's travel demand model, and they ran their plan, and they were able to argue somewhat successfully that their plan was in some ways better for carbon emissions reductions. And through that, they were able to convince this board of representatives from different municipalities across the San Francisco Bay Area to make a few major concessions to support activities in that direction. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be said about grassroots advocacy coalitions coming together to make changes. I only know about that because one of our co-authors did the travel demand modeling work for the coalition. I'm sure there are many other examples that are being documented. The other thing I'll mention is there's a lot of transit advocacy right now that's been very successful around advancing fareless transit. Advocacy groups and coalitions that have been pushing wins in that direction, and, you know, pushing a paradigm of thinking about what transit is and who it's for by helping planners and academics and whatnot understand that, you know, there actually is some suppressed demand among low-income people who use transit that is suppressed because of the fare, right? Maybe for the median rider, that's not the case, right? The rider who's making $80,000 a year, but for a large number of lower income people, the demand is very sensitive to those prices. And so there's been movements to push to change that, that I think have been very successful. And I've seen here in Toronto, which is a bit of a different context than the US, some success there as well.
Thank you, Matt, for your response to that. And thank you, Hannah, for that question. I think it's very important that as transit planners, we ask ourselves, how can we make sure that we know where the problems are and how to fix that? And it's not directly out from our findings for, you know, our results, but I just want to know that getting essential riders, especially those who are under vulnerable situations, such as recent immigrants, such as people in poverty, who are from ethnic or racial minorities, they usually lack the collective advocacy to really advocate for themselves, for the resource, or the infrastructure that they need. So having grassroots organization, local coalitions, working with them to advocate or to help them obtain information and let them amplify their voices is very important. And I think we're seeing more awareness to that, and we're seeing more practices across the nation on that as well, which is promising.
Yeah, one thing I've seen really fast that I thought was a really cool idea, like interactive mapping, so people can log on to a portal and then point out on the map, I'm trying
Yes.
to get here and I can't. I think that's really nice.
Yes, exactly. I was going to say that one of our co-authors actually participated in a study project by, I think it's initiated by National Transit Center, creating a transit dashboard. So you can see in US major cities, you can log into the dashboard very visually, very friendly, that you can just point to the location to see how transit system is functioning, and if it's equitable, how's that impacting people. I think it's very exciting.
Okay, I'll leave a minute more for any more questions and then we will wrap up.
And thank you for all those questions and comments. We really appreciate it. And then I want to take a second to give a shout out to all the presenters and researchers today in our studies. It's very hard to do study in isolation in the pandemic. Yeah, great work, everyone. I really appreciate everyone's presentation.
Likewise, I just want to give a big thank you to our presenters. And I believe this recording will be made available for attendees at some point in the future. And I think one of the things that really threads all of these presentations together is a realization that, COVID-19 was an exogenous shock to our cities, how they run and how people respond to incentives and transportation systems. And so it's good to see that people are digging in deep and doing what's necessary, whether that's online recruitment or digging into the weeds of data to really figure out what are we learning about travel behavior and how travel behavior responds and adapts to crises coming out of this pandemic. Well, fingers crossed that we're coming out of it, mind you. But so just thanks again to everyone for this great and interesting work. And I believe the next session is starting in just a minute. So have a good one.
Thank you to our moderator, Matt. Good job.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Starting, I would like to discuss a little bit about the housekeeping. So for each presentation, we'll get 20 minutes, and then we'll get 10 minutes for question and answer. And I will try to provide a reminder 3 minutes and 1 minute before the 20-minute finishes. I'll also keep a track on the chat box, but as the speakers, you guys feel free to reply any questions. And I'll also try to compile some of the very important questions and ask at the end of the presentation. So our first speaker is Dr. Annesha Enam. So Dr. Enam, will you be presenting or I should run the recording?
No, I can present. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. So let me actually give a short introduction of Dr. Enam, and you can feel free to share your screen in the meantime. So let me try to find the thing. Yes, so Dr. Annesha Enam is working currently as an assistant professor of transportation engineering at the Department of Civil Engineering in Britt. Dr. Enam completed her PhD at University of Connecticut, USA. And after completing her PhD, she worked at Agrawal National Laboratory for a couple of years, where she focused on developing behavioral models for evaluating mobility and energy efficiency of regional transportation system in the US. Her research interests includes statistical and econometric modeling of travel behavior, transportation planning, transportation system simulation, and the application of data mining and machine learning techniques for safety and mobility analysis. So without further ado, Dr. Enam.
Thank you, Dr. Hasnine, for the introduction. It's my pleasure to be able to be in front of you for this presentation. I do also have my co-authors, Dr. Zia Wadud and Dr. Sheikh Mukhlas Rahman in the audience. So we actually completed this study a couple months back. As the title says, our objective was to investigate the impact of COVID-19 related non-pharmaceutical interventions on mobility and accidents in Bangladesh. So those of you, if you're not familiar with where Bangladesh is, it's actually a country in the South Asian region. It's located near India. We have India on 3 sides of us, and then Bay of Bengal on the south. But more than the location, I think more important aspect or more interesting aspect is that we have almost half of the US's population. Our population is 163 million, but our land area is that of is comparable to the state of Illinois. So we are actually one of the most densely populated countries of the world. So our first COVID case was detected in early March in 2020. And like many other governments of the world, our government also had a hard time controlling the curve of the disease. And obviously, since I think less than 10% of our population are still, it's only less than 10% of our population has gotten only 1 dose of the vaccination. So that's why still we are using the containment and closure type of interventions to control the spread of the disease and to maintain the social distances and to reduce the pressure on the medical system or the healthcare system. So this is actually a part of a project. The project started in late 2019. I wasn't a part of this project back then, but I was lucky enough to be a member of the project afterwards. And I'm just going to present some of the findings from that project. And it was just a project to genuinely investigate what are some of the interventions that are actually effective in reducing the mobility or limiting the social contact between people, because we have such a high density, and which interventions are not that effective, and then disseminate that among the general population as well as among the policymakers. So that's what the background was of the study. And just to summarize the objectives of the study, we wanted to study the impact of the COVID-19 related interventions, and I use the term non-pharmaceutical interventions. That's because, as I mentioned, the COVID vaccination has just started, but only less than 5% of our population got the both doses of the vaccination. So it's mostly the non-pharmaceutical interventions that the government is still depending on and will probably be depending on throughout this year as well. So that was the objective of the study, to study the impact of those interventions on the traffic and mobility, which interventions are actually working and which are not. And also we wanted to know or study if these interventions had some impact on the accident and fatality in Bangladesh. Moving on to the data, as I mentioned, we wanted to study the impact of different interventions on the inter-regional mobility as well as on accidents. So we basically ended up working with 3 different sets of data. Our data were actually quite aggregate in nature, but that's the best we had in hand at that time. So that's what we used to investigate the impact of the interventions on intra-regional mobility. We relied on the Google mobility data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Google mobility data. It is a data set that Google made available for our country, that is for Bangladesh, starting from the 15th of February 2020. So this mobility data is nothing but it gives us an indication about the number, the percentage changes in the visitors at different activity locations across the country with respect to a baseline. And for the baseline, they used the number of visitors at different locations between the period January 1st to January 15th. So that's the data we use to understand the changes in the inter-regional mobility and how that varied with different types of interventions. For the inter-regional mobility exploration, we had access to data from a private tool company who provided us classified vehicle count on a major highway in Bangladesh that connects the capital capital of Bangladesh, that is Dhaka, and another major city, the major port city of Bangladesh, which is Chittagong. This is also a daily vehicle count, and we had this data available for both the years 2019 and 2020. For accidents also, we had data from 2 years, but this data was temporarily more aggregate than the mobility data. These data were only available at the level of monthly frequency. And we had this data both at the level of the country as well as the level of the capital, Dhaka. Yeah, with that, let me proceed. So these are some of the interventions on the non-pharmaceutical interventions that we have investigated. As I mentioned, the first case of COVID was identified in early March in Bangladesh in 2020. After that, the first intervention came in the form of the closing of the educational institutions. And this is actually one of the interventions that is still in place, meaning we are teaching in an online format, but none of the educational institutions have gone back to the physical classes as of yet. Then I think the major intervention came on 26th of April. That was the closing of the offices, garments, which is one of the major industries in Bangladesh, shopping malls, and the public transportation. After that, on 5th of April, an interesting thing happened. As I mentioned, garments is one of the major export industries of Bangladesh. Bangladesh relies on garment industries for foreign currency. So what happened on the 5th April is that there was an argument between the garment owner and the government about the opening of the garment factories that led to the opening of the garment factories for a very short period. During that time, the garment employees actually came back to their work location only to get to know that their factories will be closed again. And so they had to get back to their homes. So I just wanted to mention it because I just wanted to show you that at that point in time, like governments of the other countries, the government of Bangladesh was also making these decisions or undertaking these interventions on a trial and error basis. And that's why I just wanted to highlight this. After that, actually on 26th of April, after 1 month, the garments opened and the shopping malls opened shortly afterwards. But it took a much longer time for the offices and the public transportation to get to the full capacity. The offices started to open at limited capacity starting from the end of May. Similarly, public transportation also started to open at limited capacity starting from the 1st of June. Another interesting intervention started on 22nd of July. Actually, the declaration came on 21st of July, if I'm not wrong. The intervention was a health regulation, basically. The government asked the people that they have to wear a face covering whenever they are going out because the offices and the public transportation started to open up even if it was at limited capacity. So other than these interventions, we also wanted to include the impact of 2 major religious festivals that held during that time, because from the local experience, we know that these religious festivals have a great impact on the day-to-day mobility or the traffic. So that's why we thought that since we are trying to explore the impact of different interventions on the mobility, in that case, it will be necessary to control for these religious festivals as well, which are the Eid al-Fitr and the Eid al-Adha. So this is the classified vehicle count data that we use to investigate the impact of different interventions on the inter-regional mobility. And as I mentioned, this data was collected from a major highway that connects Dhaka and Chittagong, 2 major cities in Bangladesh. And this was a classified vehicle count. So the type of vehicles that we have plotted here are motorcycle, cars and microbuses, buses, and then the total count of the vehicles on it's not actually a road, it's a system of 2 bridges, 2 tolled bridges for which we had the vehicle count. I'm just going by the figures on the left-hand side of the slide left-hand side of the slides because the patterns are pretty similar for the left hand side and the right hand side figures. So as I mentioned, we had data from the 2019 and 2020. You'd notice that the patterns are quite similar, but one interesting thing that we noticed for motorcycle is that in 2020, the number of motorcycles count was much higher compared to that in 2019. And for motorcycles, microbuses, buses, and total count, if we trace the pattern, we would notice that during the strictest lockdown period, meaning from the end of March to the end of April, obviously there was a dip in the number of vehicles, and it's obvious in the motorcycle and the car count. And there's a zero count for the public buses because government was trying to restrain movement by closing the activity locations, and they imposed strict restrictions on the movement of the public buses, but there wasn't any explicit restriction on the movement of the motorcycle and the private cars. If I'm not wrong, my co-authors might chime in afterwards. So that's why the public bus count was zero during this period. However, the motorcycle and the car dropped compared to the 2019, but still there were movement. And we noticed some peaks during the two festivals, the Eid al-Fitr and the Eid al-Adha. Another thing which we found interesting and we wanted to point out is the peak or the spike just before the strictest lockdown started on 26th of May. 26th of March. That's because government announced this lockdown 2 or 3 days prior to the commencement of the lockdown. The lockdown started from 26th of March, but they announced it 1 or 2 days before, and the announcement came as a general holiday announcement. So many people actually left their work location to reconvene with their family and relatives, and that actually resulted in a spike just before the lockdown started. In terms of the total vehicle count, the one thing that I just want to mention is that the spikes during the festivals are lower. That's because the total count not only includes the private modes like motorcycles and cars, but also include the buses and trucks. And since these two festivals are observed as public holidays, so the total number of count goes down during the days of the festivals. Then next, moving on to the Google mobility data that we used for the intra-regional mobility analysis. And those of us who are familiar with the data, we know that this is nothing but the percentage change in the number of visitors at different activity locations. And these activity locations are coded by Google themselves. So they basically code the locations of different activities across Bangladesh and how the number of visitors changed across the time. That's the data we had. So obviously before the intervention started, so the interventions are shown by the vertical lines, whatever the interventions I presented before. Just before the intervention started, obviously the value was close to zero, meaning there was not much deviation compared to the baseline. But with the intervention of 26th of March, we see a drastic drop in the number of visitors. And I think this observation is constant across different activity locations, grocery and pharmacy, parks, workplace, as well as transit stations. And then as government started to ease out the interventions, we see that the mobility started to rise. We see some distinct peaks during the time of the festivals. We also notice that there are drops in the workplace during the time of the festivals because these days are observed as holidays. In terms of presidential plot, actually this gives us the number of hours people spend at their home location, or the change in the number of hours compared to the baseline time. So as expected, after the intervention started, people started to stay at home for longer period. So this graph is basically a mirror image of the retail and recreation, grocery and pharmacy, and other curves. So moving on to the accident, we had accident data for 2 years. We already mentioned that. And actually we collected accident data from 2 different sources. One is from the Accident Research Institute. That's an institute at Bangladesh University of Engineering Technology. And we also had the same information from Bangladesh Police. They collect this information, and this information is referred to as first information record of the accidents. So we had both the accident data, accident count, as well as the fatality count and the injuries count. And we had data for the country as well as for the capital, Dhaka. We used 2 sources of data just to see whether there were much discrepancies between the 2 data sources. And we noticed that the injury data, we had significant variations in the injuries data. So that's why we didn't use that for the analysis. We conducted our analysis only with the crash data as well and with the fatalities data. Moving on to the method, obviously we started with the data cleaning and data collection and cleaning. After that, we moved on to the analysis. For analysis, for the accident data, as I mentioned, this data was temporarily very aggregate. We had only data at monthly frequencies. So that's why we did some statistical inferences, but we didn't build any model with the accident data. For the exploration of the impact of interventions on mobility, we developed some time series models. Actually 2 sets of model, one set for understanding the changes in the interregional mobility and another set of model to understand the changes in the intraregional mobility. So moving on to the results, the first set of models, I will introduce the models that we developed to understand the impact on the interregional mobility. Just to remind you, this model was developed with the classified vehicle count data. We ended up developing 3 different sets of model, one for the motorcycles, one for car and microbus, and other one for bus and minibus. So in all these models, this is the generic form of the model. In all these models, the dependent variable was the count of the vehicles on a certain day. As the independent variable, since the vehicle count of the successive days will be obviously correlated, so that's why we used an autoregressive form, and these are the autoregressive coefficients. Then we have the interventions. We converted the interventions into dummies excuse me, into dummy variables, meaning whenever an intervention is active, we coded that as 1, and whenever an intervention was inactive, it was coded as 0. And other than that, we also included some day of week dummies. That's because our data was not normalized for different days of the week. So that's why we control for that. And as I mentioned, we also control for the major local festivals, because that anyways influence the vehicle counts. Moving on to the results, I'll just highlight the interesting results because of the sake of time. I think I'm running a little behind. One interesting thing we noticed is that during the period when the public transportation was closed, this increased the motorcycle count significantly. And obviously, we actually modeled the percentage change in the count of the vehicles in the year 2020 with respect to the year 2019. So we noticed that during the period when the public transportation was closed, actually the motorcycle count increased significantly. And there were actually many newspaper articles that came during that time, and it actually hinted that people were relying on these private modes more and more, because there were not many explicit restrictions on this private mode. So since people didn't have access to the public transport, they used these modes to travel on the highways or to get from one city to another. That's what we that's something that we could capture in our model. Another interesting thing we noticed was the impact of the mandatory mask regulation. As I mentioned, from the late July, when the officers and the public transportation started to come into operation at limited capacity, government imposed a mandatory mask regulation. And what we noticed is that actually after the mandatory mask regulation, the number of cars and microbuses started to increase on the highway. And we think that, or we hypothesize that that's because people started to feel safe, at least to be around their friends and family, or at least to be around the people they know, and that prompted the increase in the number of cars and microbuses during this time. Other than that, we control for the Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, the two festivals, and we also try to control it in a way so that even if there are some differential impacts before the festival, during the festival, and after the festival, we wanted to capture all of those. Just a summary of whatever I presented before. The blue line represent the impact on the motorcycle count. The orange line represents the impact on the car and microbus count, and then the green lines represent the impact on the bus counts. I'll not spend much time on this slide. Moving on to the next set of results. Again, the model form for investigating the inter-regional mobility was very similar to that of investigating the inter-regional mobility, meaning it was also an autoregressive model. We developed 6 different models for 6 different activity locations, and the other independent variables were pretty similar to what we used in the last model. Here also, we noticed that the impacts of different interventions were quite significant and expected, we would say. And we actually noticed that most of the interventions were quite effective in reducing the mobility in most cases. Though we noticed that the complete closure of the office and public transportation were much more effective in reducing the mobility compared to the half closure of the office and public transportation. Another thing is, in case of mandatory masks, we noticed that people actually started to, the number of visitors actually started to increase drastically after the mandatory mask rule was introduced, and the opposite effect is observed on the residential stay duration. The effect is negative, indicating that as the mandatory mask regulation was introduced, people started to stay less and less time at their home. So as we're mentioning, the solid rectangles basically indicate that the effects of the interventions are statistically significant. So most of the rectangles are solid, and for the activity locations, the effects are negative, indicating that the closure of different institutions actually reduce the mobility, and the closure of different institutions actually increase the homestay duration. So that's why for residential model, the effects are positive. And as I mentioned, for mandatory mask, it was very significant for both the activity locations as well as for the residential stay. Moving on to the accident part, this is just a reiteration of the curve that we had before. As I was mentioning, we wanted to investigate whether the accident and the fatalities dropped because the mobility reduced during the COVID disruption period. And by COVID disruption period, I mean the period from April to August, when most of the interventions were active. And we noticed that obviously, since the mobility reduced for the country as well as for the capital city, the mobility reduced. So the accidents and the fatalities reduced. So the orange line indicates the COVID disruption period, and the blue line indicates the normal period. So obviously, both the accidents and the fatalities were lower during the disruption period than during the normal period. But this is kind of expected because people were going out less, so it is expected that there will be less number of accidents and fatalities. We thought that the more interesting question would be whether this reduction is still significant after we control for the mobility. And since we didn't have access to vehicle miles travel data, we actually normalized the accident and the fatality by the Google mobility data. And in order to make sure that our results are robust, we used 3 different measures to normalize the accident and the fatality rates. So the result was quite interesting. For Bangladesh, we noticed that at the level of the country, actually, both the accident and the fatality rates increased during the disruption period, and this increase was statistically significant. So the roads actually became unsafe during this period, and some of the reasons could be, we found that papers have come out that during this period the speeds went up on the highways, and people were stressed, so it can be expected that the driving behavior was not that safe during that period. So at the country level, that's what we noticed, that actually the normalized accidents and the fatality rates went up during the disrupted period. However, for the capital, which is an urban place mostly, for the capital, the normalized accident and fatality rate dropped. And it was quite significant as well, at least at the level of 90% confidence. And that's because we thought that's mostly because of the improvement in the safety of the vulnerable road users. Vulnerable road users, meaning we are mostly hinting at the pedestrians. We noticed that for the capital, there was a drastic change in the number of accidents involving the pedestrians, whereas this change was not that significant for the country. This might be the main reason why the roads in Dhaka became safer, or the roads of the capital became safer, because the roads became safer for the vulnerable road users, and there were less number of motorcycles. That's why the roads of Dhaka became safer. But when we looked at the country as a whole, the roads did not seem to become safe during the COVID disrupted period. In summary, I just would like to summarize the few points I have already mentioned. From the interregional mobility analysis, the most interesting thing that we noticed is that though the public transportation went down on the highway, the motorcycles seem to have picked up that drop, and full closures were found to have greater impact in reducing the mobility on the interregional highways compared to the half closures. For intra-regional mobility, the full closure, half closure result was similar. However, some additional results that we found interesting was the effect of the mask mandate. We noticed that with the start of the mask mandate policy, people started to go out more and more. They started to spend less time at home. That was an interesting observation. And mask mandate regulation, or this type of regulation, we didn't find very many studies where people studied both the containment and closure type of interventions, as well as the interventions of the health regulations like mask mandate. So we thought that this is an interesting observation we had. And for the accident results, I think I just went through it, so I probably will not just go through it again. But the bottom line is the roads of the country became safe. It became unsafe during the disruption period. The accidents, the normalized accidents and fatalities went up, but for the capital, the impact was opposite. During the disruption period, the roads seem to have become safer. That's because it probably became safer for the vulnerable road users like the pedestrians. With that, I'd like to stop, and would be happy to take any questions. And as I mentioned, we also have other authors of the paper in the audience. I'm sure they'll be happy to chime in to add if I have missed anything or to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Enam. I know it is 1 a.m. in Bangladesh. Thank you for joining us in this late night. So since we are running out of time, I would take one question for now, and maybe at the end of our session, we could take more questions. So anyone, if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute yourself, but we'll take just one question for now. If not, that I will ask one question. So I saw that you guys used lots of this Google mobility indicator as a dependent variable. But I was thinking I was thinking about independent variables. So you use lots of this Google mobility indicator and also these intervention effects as a binary variables. So I was thinking, have you guys tried to use the actual COVID-19 infection number or the infection rate as an independent variable?
Yes, we didn't include that in this study, but that was also a part of the study where we tried to see the effect of the interventions on the cases, the number of cases or the positivity rate directly, and we also tried to relate the interventions with the cases as well. But yeah, that was that. We didn't include that in that paper. We wanted to keep it more like mobility focused. That's why we didn't present that results here. But
Yes.
Dr. Ziawudud has sent the link to the report, and you'll get the results from that.
Yes, and that makes sense. Maybe those stuff maybe would be correlated also anyway. So that also makes sense not to include. Anyways, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So our next speaker will be Elisa Borowski. She's a fifth-year PhD candidate at Northwestern University in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering with a specialization in transportation system analysis and planning. Her research examines the use of crowdsourced mobility during the multi-hazard disruptions. The goal of her research is to contribute to the development of community-tailored resilience strategies. Elisa is a recipient of the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship. She holds a master's degree in civil engineering with a focus on structures and materials, and the double major bachelor's degree in English and anthropology from the University of New Mexico. So without further ado, Ms. Borowski.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Just set this up. Can you see my slides and hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, all right, thank you so much. All right, so today I will be presenting on some research that I've done on evacuation ride sharing during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and my colleague, Victor Cedillo, and my advisor, Dr. Amanda Stathopoulos. So beginning with the introduction, the idea behind this research is that we've done prior research on evacuation decision-making and ride sharing during evacuations. During the pandemic, we wanted to explore this question of how does that decision-making change when there are multiple hazards happening at once. So during 2020, there were about $22 billion weather and climate disasters across the US. And we're focusing specifically on floods. So we can see a lot of these severe weather events occurring in the Midwest and the South of the US, which is where our study is focusing. So the type of decision-making that we are looking at is evacuation behavior. So whether or not to evacuate, and if you do evacuate, what kind of mode you'll use to evacuate. And if people would be willing to share a ride with a stranger during this multi-hazard evacuation. And we thought that this research question is particularly interesting because a lot of the emergency messaging that occurs around these events is contradictory. So during the pandemic, we were told to stay inside, stay away from others, shelter indoors. And then during an evacuation, you're told to flee your home, to sort of congregate with the masses on the roads and in shelters. So we were curious, how do individuals balance these different risks and how do they navigate this sort of complex decision-making space? More specifically, the motivation for this particular study was sort of early on in the pandemic in May 2020. There was a flood evacuation that occurred in central Michigan in Midland. There were 2 dams that failed consecutively and over 11,000 individuals had to evacuate. And this was during the early fairly strict stay-at-home orders where anything non-essential was closed for that period. So the research questions that I'll be addressing in today's presentation will be in 2 parts. So first, I'll look at the willingness to share evacuation rides with a stranger during the pandemic. And then the second part, we are analyzing an evacuation choice experiment that we did and looking specifically at the role of social influence in this multi-hazard evacuation decision-making space. In traditional single hazard evacuation research, we see that social influence has a positive effect. When people are deciding whether or not to evacuate, they tend to see what their friends and family or neighbors are doing and are more likely to do what they're doing. But in the pandemic scenario, where the crowd itself presents a risk of viral contagion, we're curious, are people still willing and wanting to do what others are doing and to be around others if that itself is a risk? And then within that, we're looking at what happens when the different elements of this multi-hazard event are varied. So what happens as the flood threat level changes and also as people's perception about the risk of the pandemic changes. So next I'll talk about our data and methods for this research. We developed a web-based survey, which we deployed at the end of June last year, and we had about 600 respondents. And we deployed this in 3 Midwestern states and 3 Southern states, so Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Georgia, Louisiana, and Mississippi. And we identified these as being 6 states that had a high risk of flooding. And also within each region, there is 1 state that represents each of the 3 different stay-at-home statuses at that time. So 1 had reopened, 1 was pausing, and the 3rd would have already reopened. The survey that we designed sort of follows this flow. We're asking about prior evacuation experience, and within that, we have some questions about emotion and threat perception, which I'll be talking about today. Then we ask some questions about social capital, some cognitive and structural measures from the literature, as well as an egocentric name generator, where we ask respondents to name the 5 individuals who they think would be most helpful to them in an evacuation event, and to describe their relationship with each of those individuals. What I'll be focusing on more today is this choice experiment, where we have 4 alternatives, 3 different rides, and the option to stay, as well as 6 attributes, which I'll describe in a couple of slides in more detail. And then attitudes around resource sharing, so specifically ride sharing, what kind of compensation is desired for sharing a ride with a stranger in an evacuation, what sorts of policies should be implemented if this is done through ride-hailing companies, some questions about other resource sharing, which I won't be talking about today, and then a lot of sociodemographics about our survey sample. So for the emotion questions, we began the survey by sharing a real-life experience of someone who was in the Michigan flood evacuations and what that felt like. And then we asked the respondents to rate how likely they would be to feel each of the following emotions in that situation: angry, scared, anxious, or sad. And then our choice experiment presented respondents with a map saying, imagine you are home and you need to evacuate a 5-mile radius within the next 2 hours. And imagine that you don't have access to a personal vehicle. And then the level of threat increases as the scenarios go on. So there are 9 scenarios in total for each respondent, and they'll see 3 at each of the following threat levels: low, moderate, and extreme. And the alternatives and attributes here are shown, where we have cost of the ride, distance you have to walk to catch that ride, how long you have to wait for the ride to show up, how long it will take to travel in that vehicle, crowding within the vehicle. So you might be a passenger in a ride, sitting in the back seat, sitting in the passenger seat, or you might have the vehicle to yourself. And then some information about what your 5 closest peers have chosen hypothetically. For willingness to share, we ask respondents to imagine that they're a driver in a personal vehicle, and would they offer a ride to another evacuating individual in the neighborhood who they don't know if they had the spare capacity. And if you were a passenger in a shared ride, would you allow another evacuating individual who you do not know to join your ride? For the data analysis for both parts, we estimated a random parameter logit model. For willingness to share a ride, we sort of created these 4 different possible alternatives where you might share as both a driver and a passenger, as a passenger only, as a driver only, and not in either case. And then for our choice experiment, this was estimated in willingness to pay space. And this was done because we had random terms that were defined as having different types of distributions. So our cost parameter was log normally distributed, and our peer influence parameter was normally distributed. So by estimating willingness to pay in the model itself, instead of doing a post-analysis calculation, it just took care of those different distributions for us. So moving on to our results, I'll first talk about willingness to share rides. So on average across the sample, individuals felt like they wanted to be compensated $30 an hour to share a ride with a stranger during an evacuation during the pandemic. And they were on average willing to take about 15 to 18 minutes to go out of their way to pick up that individual who needed the ride. In terms of ride hailing company policies that they would like to see in place if this was done more formally, they felt like wearing a mask, the driver wearing a mask was the #1 most important thing, and then having the passengers' data protected, the ability to track the vehicle, the driver being able to navigate without GPS, having a background check on the driver, being able to socially distance within the vehicle. We also asked how important it was that the driver was similar to the respondent in various characteristics, and those were among the least important things to consider in this case. We asked some open-ended questions about what might encourage you or prevent you from sharing an evacuation ride during the pandemic. Some things that rise to the top for encouraging the sharing is wearing masks, some monetary compensation, and there are some other things about what the person you're picking up is like. So if they're younger or older or a mother, so most likely these would be individuals who were perceived as needing more help. And the things that would prevent sharing are if the individual looks sick, things related to being able to distance yourself within the vehicle, and other concerns like safety, fear, danger, which might not necessarily have anything to do with the pandemic. So for our Logit model, we have these 4 alternatives. Super share is what we called sharing as both a driver and a passenger, and then we have driver only, passenger only, and not sharing at all. We had 1 random coefficient, and this was the total preparedness for a flood event. So that had significant variance across respondents in the survey. And then we had 4 interactions between different socio-demographics that were significant as well. So here's what the results look like, the marginal effects across the 4 different alternatives. Some trends that we see, so there are some factors that we see in traditional single hazard evacuation research. So individuals that were more likely to share tended to be female, they were Black, they were employed, and they were households with children. And that's very much in line with what we've seen in the past. There were some other findings that were surprising that might be specific to the sociopolitical context of the pandemic. And that is that people who identified as Republican were more likely to share, and individuals who were under the age of 36 were more likely to share. And that sort of goes against what we've seen in some single hazard evacuation events. And that might have to do with how the pandemic was perceived by those different social identities at that time. And then some emotional factors were also significant. So if there was more fear, or fear was more likely around the evacuation event, or if the pandemic was perceived as being a greater threat, individuals were less likely to share. So next I'll talk about the results from our choice experiment. Again, this is just asking, are people likely to follow the crowd when the crowd itself presents a risk of viral contagion? For this, we estimated in our Logit model the 3 ride alternatives and the option to stay. This is estimated in willingness to pay space. So our cost parameter is pulled out to the front. And that's actually log normally distributed random parameter. And then our peer influence parameter is a normally distributed random parameter. For our model results, looking at the random parameters, we have the cost parameter, the share of peers choosing one of the rides, and then the share of peers deciding to stay. And we estimated those separately. They go in opposite directions. And you can see that the standard deviation, which is significant for both, is quite large compared to the mean. So there is a very wide distribution across respondents in terms of whether this is perceived as something positively influencing that choice or negatively influencing that choice. And we can also see that our willingness to pay space model shows a better fit compared to the same model estimated in preference space. So looking in more detail at the parameters that were significant to deciding to stay during an evacuation, we see some factors that are significant in some of the more traditional literature, things that make it very difficult for someone to evacuate, such as having a disability, having pets, being older, and having more luggage to take with you. And then some emotional factors. So perceiving the pandemic to be a major threat to one's own health makes it far more likely that that person will stay in an evacuation event. Having more anxiety around the evacuation makes it more likely that they will stay. But interestingly, having more fear makes it more likely that they will evacuate. And one possible explanation is that this might be the difference between a freeze and a flee response in response to a stressful event. And then finally, for those who felt that the pandemic was a major threat to their health, as the flood threat level increased, they became more and more likely to evacuate. Looking at the decision of which ride to choose, we see some traditional factors that were significant, such as travel time and wait time. So the longer one had to wait for that ride or spend in that vehicle, the less likely they were to choose it. And we see that a wait time is less desirable than travel time. So having to stay behind and wait for your ride is more painful, essentially, than spending more time in the vehicle itself. And then some maybe context-specific factors. So having to walk further in a flood makes someone much less likely to choose that ride. And then having to share that ride, whether in the back seat or front seat, makes them less likely to choose that ride compared to having a private vehicle. And that's probably somewhat pandemic specific. In terms of following the peers, when looking at the decision to stay, this is sort of what we see in traditional literature, that people are likely to follow their peers. It has a positive correlation with that choice. And as the flood threat level increases to moderate and extreme, that effect sort of neutralizes to zero and even goes toward being less likely to follow their peers. And then in terms of something that was kind of surprising and might be context specific is in terms of choosing the ride, people wanted to go away from what their peers were doing, do the opposite or do something different. And as the flood threat level increases, that also neutralizes towards zero, and it becomes, it doesn't have a huge impact on that attribute on choosing a ride. So finally, some conclusions, summarizing our key findings. For part one, which is on ride sharing, we found that the willingness to share evacuation rides is positively correlated with different sociodemographics, such as being female, under the age of 36, Black, or Republican, and some social environment factors, such as households with children, being more physically proximate in location to the social network that you identified as being important to helping you in an evacuation event, and also having more positive attitudes around sharing with your neighbors in general. And that willingness is negatively correlated with some factors. Some of them are emotional factors, like having greater threat perception around the pandemic and having more sense of fear around the evacuation, but also some resource factors. So having more income and having more preparedness supplies actually makes someone less likely to share with a stranger. And then looking at part two, which is peer influence in evacuation decision-making, we see that the decision of whether or not to evacuate is positively correlated with what peers are doing, but the decision of how to evacuate, which ride to choose, is negatively correlated. And as flood threat level increases, we see a decrease in the magnitude of these correlations. So finally, some concluding remarks. We see both traditional and context-specific factors being significant in this multi-hazard decision-making space. Applying this to emergency communication, we could emphasize or de-emphasize different risks associated with these different hazards in a multi-hazard event. And we can also emphasize or de-emphasize what others are doing in the area. And this could be used to nudge disaster response in different directions, depending on what's advisable at that time. And these are very these findings are very specific to this flood and pandemic multi-hazard scenario. So future work should definitely explore decision-making within the context of different types of overlapping events, and most likely the findings will be somewhat different. So with that, I thank you. I have my email address here if you would like to ask questions after. And the first part on willingness to share has been published in Transportation Research Interdisciplinary Perspectives if anyone would like to read up more about that. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elisa. So if anyone has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
And I'll just share a link to our paper in the chat box.
Thank you so much. So if not, then I have a couple of questions. So
Sure.
I was thinking, like, you did this survey and the results. Do you think that COVID-19 is a significant impact on the choices? If we are thinking that if there is COVID-19 and if there is no COVID-19, do you think there will be a huge difference in terms of this, their willingness to actually share a ride with other people?
That's a really good question. Yeah, we don't have specific findings to compare to this same study without COVID-19. I think the context specific findings maybe would change, like being Republican, being younger. I think based on just other evacuation literature that was done, studies that were done without COVID, some of the factors seem like they are different and some of them seem like they're very similar. So it kind of depends, I think. Yes. And also I was thinking about the vehicle ownership. So do you think at the household level vehicle ownership could affect their actual choice, shared ride or not? If someone has, 4 vehicles in their household, then, Yeah, that's a great question. We had a variable for 0 vehicle household that did not come out to be significant, at least in the willingness to share. But we did expect that to have an impact, I think. Yes. Yeah. So the socio-demographic information, you guys also collected these on the top of the choice experiment, right? So you got their socio-demographic information in the survey and also the choice experiment on the top of the label preference part, right? Yes. Okay. Everything I shared was all in one survey. It was a pretty long survey. Yeah, makes sense. And 9 scenarios, right? So 9 scenarios are pretty huge, especially choice experiment. This is really tough. And the data collection you guys did in a short amount of time. So how did you guys reach out to these individuals, by email or phone? We used Prolific. So yeah, we designed our survey using Qualtrics and then we distributed over Prolific. Yes. Thank you so much. So we have actually one question from Qian. So let me try. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is CJ. I just have a specific question because I noticed that your partisans' orientation also play a role here too, affecting the share ride behavior, such as Republican versus Democrat. Is that in your opinion, is that the causal relationship or is just a correlation? Yeah, that's a really good question. It could be somewhat correlated. We controlled for things like income and what else would it be correlated with? Age, maybe. Yeah, it's hard for me to say. I know that that's a question that people ask often. I don't feel like I have a great answer for you. I think it's a good question to ask. It's fine, thank you. Yeah.
So if we don't have any other question, I think thank you so much for your time, and then we'll move to our next presenter. And if you guys have any question in the meantime, feel free to put your question in the chat box, and I think Elisa and also Dr. Enam will be happy to answer them anytime during the session or also after the session. So thanks again. So we'll move to our next speaker. And Maher, will you be presenting, or would you like me to share the recording?
Please share the recording. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So let me first give an introduction of Maher, and then I'll share his recorded presentation. So Maher Said is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University and the Buffet Institute Global Impact Graduate Fellow. His research interests are in behavioral analysis and choice modeling, activity mobility in developing countries, and near future adoption of novel mobility technologies. His current research focuses on the impact of COVID-19 on mobility and quality of life as part of the US Department of Transportation Tier 1 UTC on telemobility, and awarded to Northwestern University in partnership with UC Berkeley and UT Austin. So I may need a couple of minutes to share the screen, so please stay with me while I try to start the recording. And Maher, if the sound or anything has an issue, just feel free to let me know, then I'll try to fix it.
Definitely, thank you.
No problem.
Hello everyone, my name is Maher Said, and today I'm going to present a study with my colleagues Jason Soria and Amanda Stathopoulos on the shifts in consideration towards using hailed modes of travel such as ride-hailing or taxi during the COVID-19 pandemic. And specifically, the study will focus on what factors and attributes have led to shifts in consideration during the pandemic for using those modes, and how much that consideration has shifted. And as we all know by now, the COVID-19 pandemic has been ongoing for over a year. I'm not going to go over dates and trends, but we understand the extent to which the pandemic has affected our lifestyles and businesses and economies and the world overall. And one sector that has been specifically hit hard by the pandemic is that of hailed modes of travel, such as ride-hailing or taxi. And these modes have been greatly impacted because during an airborne pandemic, the last thing you want to do is be a passenger in a tiny metal box with a random stranger, which is exactly what taxis and ride-hailing services offer passengers. And also we had a shortage of drivers at some point, and people were just traveling less. Between telework and online deliveries and all these services that moved to the digital world, there was far less need for people to even travel. And we can see this decline in ride-hailing taxi demand by looking at the trips in Chicago prior to the pandemic, at the start of the pandemic, and then during the pandemic. And right when the pandemic was declared, right when COVID-19 was declared as a pandemic by the World Health Organization, and that's the red dotted line that you see on the screen, we see that huge decline start to occur. And then there's the gray segment towards the end, and this is data that we know of today, but at the time of data collection, we did not know what's going to happen next. So we just observed that huge decline, and we're trying to understand what happens afterwards. And this was reflected in the news and articles everywhere. Discussions about how Uber has lost 70%, is doing 70% fewer trips in cities, and how taxi drivers were worried about their livelihood because there were not enough people taking trips. And in a study by authors from UIC, we see that people were afraid of taking ride-hailing trips and taxi trips. They were considered generally high risk to extremely high risk modes during the pandemic. And the only other mode that was considered riskier than ride-hailing taxi is that of transit. With that being said, the goals and objectives of this work are to examine the acceptability of using hailed rides. And hailed rides is the term that I'm using to collectively refer to ride-hailing taxi at the earlier stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this data has been collected in June 2020, like we mentioned earlier, which was during kind of the panic phase of the pandemic and when people didn't really understand the extent of the effects of the pandemic yet on general lifestyle and the near future. And also want to understand how the consideration of using hailed rides is going to differ between different population segments. We're talking here about age, gender, income, etc., and how people in these different groups might adopt ride-hailing or consider it differently. And we also want to pinpoint the role of unique pandemic era factors, such as whether a household has been quarantined during the pandemic, whether a household member has lost a job, etc., on the consideration of using ride-hailing. Additionally, given the polarization around COVID-19 in the US, we also want to examine the role of political views on ride-hailing adoption and whether people who have different political views have shifted in different ways, either away from or towards ride-hailing. And as I just mentioned, we did a survey in June 2020, and the survey was designed with the purpose of collecting information data relevant to hailed ride behavior and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on this behavior. And the survey had 4 main sections. The first section, which is the core of the study, asks the respondents about their likelihood of using hailed ride services for essential travel during the pandemic. And on the next slide, I'm going to detail exactly what the questions were. The second section asks respondents about information on their attitudes towards environment and technologies. So this is where we ask them about a few indicators and their level of agreement with these indicators, such as I use technology every day to improve my life, or something of that sort. The third section asks respondents about the impact that COVID-19 has had directly on their household, and this goes back to the idea of whether someone has been laid off in their household, whether they had to quarantine, etc. And the fourth section asks the respondents about their socioeconomic and demographic variables. So gender, age, ethnicity, employment status, education, household size, and income. And in that first section where we asked them about their level of consideration towards hailed ride services, we asked them 2 main questions. The first one is, how likely are they to request a typical ride-hailing service or taxi service during the pandemic? And the second question asks them about their likelihood of requesting a typical ride-hailing service or taxi service prior to the pandemic. And the idea here is that both questions are phrased as closely as possible because they're going to be used comparatively to one another, and we want to reduce bias, any kind of biases here. And also, we are aware that there is some recall bias in asking people to remember their likelihood of using a service before the pandemic. But at that point, the pandemic has been only ongoing for 3 to 4 months, at least officially. And we hope that that bias is minimal just because the time frame is small. And on this slide, we have the sample statistics from our responses. We got 691 responses, technically 700, but 9 of them needed to be cleaned either due to straight lining, being low quality, incomplete. One case was in Hawaii, which wasn't the sample that we're trying to collect. We're trying to look at contiguous United States. And we see that most of our responses come from 4 states, being California, Texas, New York, and Florida. We got responses from 46 out of the 48 states that we were sampling, in addition to Washington, D.C. In terms of gender, 50% of respondents are male, roughly 48% of respondents are female, and around 2% of respondents are non-binary. In terms of age, the sample is a bit biased toward younger respondents, with the majority of our respondents being between 18 and 45 years of age. And they're also mostly left-leaning, with 60% of respondents being Democrat, while we only have around 15% of respondents being Republican. In terms of household income, most responses are in the range between $50,000 to $100,000. Roughly 40% of responses come from that category. Looking at the willingness to use hailed ride services, we observe an obvious decrease in consideration from pre-COVID levels to COVID levels, where the average likelihood of using hailed rides decreased from 2.8 to 1 pre-COVID, which is almost equal to neither unlikely nor unlikely on the Likert scale, to 2.18 during COVID, which is a shift to unlikely on the Likert scale. And pre-COVID, the statistical mode was 4.0, which is equivalent of likely to use ride-hailing services, and it shifts to 1.0, which is equivalent of very unlikely to use ride-hailing during COVID. And if we look at the Sankey plot, we can see that more than 50% of respondents are either unlikely or very unlikely to consider using ride-hailing modes and taxi modes during the pandemic for essential purposes. However, we do observe, again looking at the Sankey plot, that some people shift upwards. And we can see the percentage of people that remain at their pre-pandemic level and those who shift downwards or upwards by looking at the plot that we have here, which is the likelihood difference comparing COVID levels to pre-COVID levels. So it's likelihood COVID minus likelihood pre-COVID. And we see that 48.5% of respondents remain at their pre-pandemic level of willingness to use hailed modes of travel, while 42.1% are less likely to use hailed modes during the pandemic. We do see 9.7% of respondents who are more likely to use hailed modes during the pandemic, and we hypothesize that these are people who might have some other restrictions in their lifestyle that necessitates that they use ride-hailing or taxi to travel during the pandemic. Maybe transit has been stopped where they live or reduced in terms of service. And in order to better understand the shifting consideration of using hailed modes of travel, we use an ordinal regression model using the difference in likelihood as the dependent variable. And by difference of likelihood, again, it's COVID, so it's the consideration level during COVID minus the consideration level pre-COVID. And while I'm not going to go over the details of ordinal regression modeling, although we have some of the formulation in front of us on the screen, I want to comment on that alpha coefficient we see on the lowest equation on the screen, and that is a level specific constant. And here what I mean by level is level of consideration, so the likelihood. And the reason we need that constant is to correct for the fact that people at different initial values of likelihood pre-pandemic, so be it 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, have a truncated set of movements towards their pandemic levels depending on where they start. So someone who starts at a pre-pandemic likelihood of 5 can either stay at 5 during the pandemic or move downwards to lower levels. And the opposite is true for people at lower levels. And that needs to be corrected for in the regression using that level specific constant, where based on your initial value of likelihood, you get a different constant. And this is not different by respondent though, so it's by level and all respondents get that same constant. And after many attempts and many estimated models, we have the final model here in front of us. And although we have a lot of details here, all the numbers, all the model statistics on this table, we're going to discuss instead a figure that simplifies these results and make them easier to understand on slides. And with the results in figure form, we can start looking at how different attributes and variables have affected the shift in likelihood of using hailed ride services compared to pre-pandemic levels. Starting with age, we see that respondents who are younger than 45 years of age have a greater reduction in likelihood of using hailed ride services compared to older respondents, which is a bit counterintuitive. However, once we start inspecting the data, we notice that these are also the respondents who were the greater adopters of hailed ride services pre-pandemic, so they're more susceptible to a consideration decrease compared to the older cohort that were lower in terms of usage of hailed ride services. We also see that men experience a greater increase in likelihood of using hailed ride services during the pandemic compared to women and non-binary respondents. And this is only significant at a p-value of 0.08. So I just want to clarify that. And urban dwellers also have a positive and significant shift in likelihood compared to non-urban dwellers, so suburban and rural areas. And this is mainly because urban dwellers are already more accustomed to ride-hailing services, which are more prevalent in these areas, and also because once the pandemic hit and the services started to be reduced, so the supply side started to be reduced in terms of ride-hailing, it was still a bit more available in urban areas compared to suburban and rural areas, and waiting times were a bit higher in those areas, which make them a bit less attractive in terms of being in terms of travel modes. Looking at household income, we notice that households with higher income have a greater reduction in shift in likelihood, and this is also a bit counterintuitive at first. However, from looking at different articles and literature, we learned that households with higher income have greater flexibility in adjusting their lifestyles around COVID-19 pandemic, which in this case might mean shifting towards private vehicles or other modes of travel, or not traveling at all given the option of telemobility and online deliveries, instead of using hailed ride services. In terms of opinions and attitudes, we see that Democrats and left-leaning respondents have a greater reduction in likelihood of using hailed ride services, which coincides a bit with the literature that left-leaning individuals are a bit more concerned with COVID and a bit more abiding by the restrictions that came along with COVID. In terms of pro-environmentalism, people who are more pro-environmental experience a positive shift in likelihood of using hailed ride services, which might be due to the marketing of ride-hailing as an environmental mode due to its shared nature, etc. In terms of people and their typical modes of travel, individuals who typically travel by private modes experience a negative shift in likelihood, and this is almost expected. These are people who have cars and are likely just to travel using their own vehicles if need be. Looking at transit, however, we also see a negative shift in likelihood, which also might be a bit counterintuitive because transit is a bit more of a complex system to navigate than ride-hailing. However, that might be because of all the efforts that a lot of transit agencies made in order to ensure social distancing within buses and trains, which is not very much an option in a tinier car where you're next to the driver. In terms of impact of COVID, states where stay-at-home duration was longer have a higher reduction in likelihood of using hailed ride services, and this might be because these states are also states that politically took the pandemic more seriously, and it could also indicate a bit of that political orientation view that we see on opinions and attitudes, that same negative effect. And households that have been quarantined have a significant and large magnitude shift in likelihood towards an increase. And this is basically because these households needed to make up for their lack of ability of going out. And so this is almost like making up for their restriction in mobility by increasing their likelihood. And we also have an interaction here between quarantine and typical mode of travel. And instead of looking at here, it's clearer to look at it on the next slide where we interact the two variables directly with each other. And here we can see the 4 different groups and their different coefficients when interacting private vehicle and quarantine. And what we notice is that once we interact private vehicle and quarantine and propagate the errors properly, the effect is actually insignificant, which means that if you are a typical private vehicle mode user, but your household did not have to quarantine, you do have a negative shift in likelihood. if you had to quarantine, but you're not a typical private vehicle mode user, your shift in likelihood is positive. However, if you're both, the shift in likelihood is insignificant, which basically means that the two effects do cancel out, even with interaction. So, in conclusion, decreasing inhaled ride consideration is expected among younger cohorts. The main adopters of ride-hailing services under normal operations, as we discussed earlier. Transit riders gravitate away from hailed rides during the pandemic, despite the extra complexity in navigating public transit in comparison to hailed services. With increasing income, consideration of hailed modes is also reduced throughout the pandemic. Individuals with democratic or left-leaning political views have lower consideration for hailed rides during the pandemic, and individuals in households that have had a quarantine member are more likely to use hailed modes compared to others, potentially as a compensation mechanism. So what's next for this work? There are a few options for extending this work in the future. But the first is including a more exhaustive list of questions directly related to COVID-19, such as mask wearing habits, vaccination, pandemic fatigue, etc. Looking at behaviors in current later stages of the pandemic, especially with the Delta variant going on right now and the uncertainty that comes with it. Assessing ride-hailing and taxi data from the past year to identify a link between findings in this study and revealed behavior, and linking the findings to policy recommendations and future strategies surrounding mobility and future extreme lifestyle disruptions. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this session and this talk. If you want to reach out, my email and Twitter are there on the slide, and the study will be posted today on arXiv. It has been submitted, it just needs to be published. So if you're curious to look at the actual paper, just look up my name on the site or the title of the paper. Please, if you have any questions, let me know, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Maher. So do you guys have any question for Maher's side? So feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question. If not, that I have to ask a few questions. So I was thinking, so you collected the data from, I think, quite a different states, right? And it is quite a broad sample, I would say. So do you think that these response may vary depending on the COVID-19 infection type and rate also? For example, some states are heavily affected, on the other hand, some states may not. So their response may vary a little bit depending on those factors. Do you think it may have a chance?
Yeah, definitely. I would expect that if we do segmentation by group of states at least, because some states don't have enough responses to just do all 46, that we'll see different results for different states. We tried to control for it in kind of an indirect way where we had the stay-at-home length. So different states at that point, the values were either 3 months, 2 months, or 1 month, or 0. So we did see that it had a significant effect, but definitely going to the data and figuring out clusters of states based on infection rate would give us even more interesting results.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And the follow-up question is, I saw that in the survey, you guys collected the data based on essential trip purpose. So would you mind clarifying what do you refer as essential trip in your study?
Yeah, so we intentionally did not specify to respondents what we want them to consider essential trips. We just explained to them that essential trip is something that is essential to them. And the reason for that is because it differs from person to person, by employment, by state, etc. So we don't want to impose any biases coming from us towards respondents. Instead, we let them select what is essential to them.
Thank you so much, Maher. So again, if any of you guys have any question for Maher, feel free to chime in and unmute yourself and ask the question. If not, then at the end of all the presentations, we may come back again and ask a few questions and do some general discussions. Okay. So thank you again, Maher. So let's go.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So let's go to our last presenter. So our last presenter will be Justin Drummond. So Justin Drummond is a first-year PhD student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Howard University. Justin's research is at the intersection of transportation engineering, econometrics, data science, and psychology, and how human behavior is connected to transportation decision-making. So currently, Justin is working on short-term and long-term impact of COVID-19 on e-commerce and mobility choices. So without further ado, Justin Drummond. So Justin, you can share your screen.
Can everyone see my screen all right?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. All right, so hello everyone. Again, my name is Justin Drummond. I'm a first-year PhD student at Howard University under the supervision of Dr. Md Sami Hasnine. So our paper that we worked on was the short-term and long-term impact of COVID-19 on e-commerce and transportation planning. We particularly looked at public transportation and travel by private car. And this paper was a literature review. So just a brief overview. I'm going to close this. So a brief overview of the presentation. First, we're going to look at the objective of our study, then the methodology and our literature review. Then we're going to look at the short-term impacts of COVID-19 on e-commerce, driving, public transportation, as well as some of the long-term predictions that we made based off of the literature review. And then if we have time, we will go over the recent work that we are doing. So the study objective, we wanted to understand the short-term and long-term effects of COVID-19. And we decided to look at e-commerce because we believe that e-commerce would have an impact on transportation at the end of the day, because if people are purchasing objects online, purchasing food items and other products online, that would discourage them obviously from traveling, through public transportation, through private cars. So we believe that e-commerce sales basically would have a major impact on transportation. And just to define e-commerce briefly, e-commerce is this buying and selling of goods associated with the delivery of products. So not necessarily just purchasing, for instance, on Amazon Prime, purchasing a movie. That would not be considered e-commerce because there's not an actual product being shipped or delivered. So e-commerce really focuses on the delivery of an actual product. And then we wanted to use all of that information again to make long-term predictions. And we have 3 scenarios which we'll look at later on that we made predictions based off of. So on our methodology, we did a literature review. We went through various search engines and we used the keywords, again, not limited to these keywords, but they were in this general area: e-commerce, driving, transit, public transportation, COVID-19 impact, short-term, long-term, and whatnot. And we were able to review multiple journals and papers just to extract information. And we wanted to just get more of a how to say this, the scope of the study. This literature review was very broad, and we just wanted to get a lot of insight into a lot of the psychological factors that impacted people that may not necessarily be taken into consideration when we are doing studies. So that was sort of the goal of this research. So just briefly to look at the short-term impacts of COVID-19 on e-commerce. Obviously, there was a drastic increase in e-commerce sales. There was a transition towards e-commerce and away from in-store shopping. So again, because of governmental restrictions, as well as people's fears of the contracting the virus, people, of course, were transitioning to e-commerce, and it was replacing a lot of the in-store shopping. Also, the e-commerce demand was a lot higher than the supply, and there was a lot of delays experienced. In a few sources, we found that there was drastic delays. There were not enough staff, not large enough facilities to accommodate all of the e-commerce. And this was actually sort of, as we're going to see later, pushing people away from e-commerce. It was a discouraging factor that made people lean away from shopping via e-commerce. So this next slide, we want to focus on the specific research from Chang and Meyerhoff, which is really interesting. Concerning e-commerce. So in this study, they looked at Taiwan, and Taiwan, of course, is near China, very close, separated by a body of water. obviously, but China was the source of the pandemic and the early epicenter of the pandemic. And Taiwan was very close to it. In Cheng and Meyerhoff's study, they discovered something very interesting, that there was no anticipation effect, according to their study, prior to the arrival of the virus. What this means is that even though COVID-19 was increasing in China, in Taiwan, essentially there was no shift from away from e-commerce or away from in-store shopping towards e-commerce as would be expected. It was expected, in the study that people in Taiwan would begin to anticipate COVID-19 coming into Taiwan, but there was no such behavior discovered. In fact, once the virus first hit, according to the study, there was a drastic shift towards e-commerce. And as confirmed cases, news reports, and Google searches increased, so did the shopping behavior increase. So they, in this study, they were basically comparing the Google searches and the amount of Google searches concerning COVID-19, coronavirus, et cetera, with shopping behavior. And they found that as there were more Google searches, which is indicating, sort of fear, anxiety, or worry concerning the virus, as that began to increase, so did their shopping behaviors change. And also as news reports and confirmed cases were continuing to increase. So I do want to emphasize one key takeaway here was that Taiwan did not actually have strong enforcement of any sort of lockdown. So this behavior was not exhibited because of governmental lockdowns. This was actually people's natural behavior, how people were to naturally respond. And what we found continually throughout this study is sort of how the government sort of expects people to react to policies or towards certain decisions is not necessarily the way that individuals will end up reacting. So it's very interesting that in spite of the fact that the government didn't, it's interesting that the government didn't enforce any lockdown efforts since it was close to China, but it was interesting to notice that individuals were reacting just out of fear of the pandemic themselves, not influenced by the government, which was something very interesting. So we also wanted to look at some of the potential benefits of e-commerce, which contributed to it, just beyond the fact that there were obviously lockdowns and restrictions in stores and whatnot, but also some of the factors that were beneficial from e-commerce. So of course, it reduced the spread of the virus. That was something that was very beneficial. It provided comfort to the public. Some studies found that there was a reduction in traffic, car accidents, traffic-related deaths, and there was less air pollution, which was very interesting. Some of the challenges of e-commerce or the disadvantages, experience was that there was a lack of infrastructure and there were great delays. Surprisingly, a lot of studies found that security risks and privacy risks were strong influencing factors, which were hindering people from actually transitioning to e-commerce. And we found this interesting because it's something that we wouldn't traditionally think about, but these studies did suggest that security risks and privacy risks, lack of product information, for instance, if I'm purchasing a banana, using an online delivery option, I'm not able to see if that banana is bruised or not, the quality of the product. So these were other factors that were sort of discouraging or had a negative impact on, transitioning away from in-store shopping towards e-commerce. Some people also had fears of just the internet and algorithm manipulation. So these things were interesting. One more thing that we do want to point out on this slide is that a study from Hensher actually found that the increase in freight transportation due to the e-commerce increase, for instance, Amazon is shipping products across the country. The increase in freight transportation was actually displacing the lack of transportation or the decrease in transportation of travel by private cars. So even though not that many people were traveling on the road via private car in their own vehicles, the increase in freight transportation was almost displacing that decrease. So it's just an interesting thing to take into consideration, that how COVID-19 decreased private car travel, but increased freight travel. So short-term impacts on driving. So obviously, most of the travel that's done by private car is done for business and commuting purposes. And during the pandemic, various studies said about 40% down during the pandemic, and there was a large transition to telecommuting, which is working from home. And some companies even found productivity. A lot of companies found even increased productivity from telecommuting. So transitioning away from traveling by private car. But it was interesting that private car was the most popular mode of transportation. So above any other public transportation service, transit, traveling by bus, using Uber, private car remained the highest and the most popular mode of any other transportation. And it's assumed to be because of the reduced risk. Karner and Fatmi, they were looking at the psychological impact of the COVID-19 on various modes of transportation and found that people felt the least risk, obviously driving in their own car because, they can control, they're not in a public vehicle where there's other people where they don't know if they have the vaccine or not, if they have, contracted the virus. All those unknown, all those uncertainties contributed to a lot of fear. So travel by private car remained the most popular mode of transportation because of the reduced risk. And obviously, on the other hand, public transportation, in particular transit, suffered some of the greatest losses. Governments, and as studies started to come out, governments found that public transportation was becoming a very strong cause for the spread of the virus. So there was a lot of policies made against public transportation, social distancing policies, reduction, trying to reduce the amount of public transportation or the amount of people in public transportation in order to reduce the spread of the virus. So that combined with people's personal fears and seeing a high risk with public transportation discourage a lot of people away from riding those different services. So public transportation suffered a lot. Most studies found that there was an over 70% decrease consistently throughout most of the studies in all forms of public transportation during and throughout the pandemic. And there was a lot of shutdowns. Public transportation services that were already struggling prior to the pandemic, they had shut down. So long-term scenarios. So we, there was a lot of information that was, very broad, but we wanted to sort of compile that information and sort of make predictions concerning future scenarios, or we propose future scenarios. 3 scenarios, basically a mostly return to normal, a partial return to normal concerning our society, or in the event there's another pandemic and everything shuts down again. And we sort of made these 3 scenarios because it would be hard to predict the long-term effects, obviously, because we don't know the nature of how the pandemic would evolve. And especially, doing this paper, since this paper was written a few months ago, the vaccines were not rolled out yet, but we still believe that this information is still relevant considering the fact that the Delta variant is out right now. And also there could be risks of future pandemics. So going on, so e-commerce law. Oh, and before we move on to the next slide, so in our mostly return to normal, the assumption was basically that vaccines would be administered and taken and also enforced by governments, and that COVID-19 would no longer be a threat and the restrictions would be lifted. That was our scenario number 1. Scenario number 2 would be a partial return to normal. So vaccines would be administered, but possibly they're not enforced or not taken because of the fears of the public. And that there would still be mass use, social distancing, and other restrictions in place. And scenario number 3 would be that there would be another pandemic, maybe a variant of COVID-19, such as the Delta, or who knows, maybe another variant could emerge, or also there could be another outbreak of another pathogen in the future. So we basically hypothesize those 3 scenarios and we're making predictions. So concerning e-commerce, e-commerce has already been steadily increasing. Murphy and Baer, they found that the U.S. Census Bureau is reporting since 1999, and e-commerce sales have been increasing steadily since. So not all of the increase in e-commerce was necessarily related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of the increase was just attributed to the fact that e-commerce is already growing from year to year. And that's something important to take into consideration for the future scenario. So in scenario 1, that does the mostly return to normal, we assume that e-commerce sales would decrease to the normal. Of course, they were at an elevated rate and still at an elevated rate during the pandemic, but we believe that if everything returns back to normal, the e-commerce sales would return to normal at a slightly elevated rate. Probably not as much of a transition because of lingering fears of the pandemic, or excuse me, I was messing up my words. There would still be lingering fears or future fears of the pandemic, which would still compel people, to use e-commerce. So even if the pandemic is completely gone and there's no threat anymore, people would still have lingering fears or future fears of a pandemic, which could discourage them from, or encourage them to use e-commerce and transition away from in-store shopping. And also there's an increased comfortability. A lot of studies found that people did online shopping for the first time ever, during the pandemic, and they've developed a level of comfortability with it, which would also lead to an increase. In scenario number 2, where there's a partial return to normal and COVID-19 still poses a threat, which is, sort of the situation that we're in right now, especially with the Delta variant. We would assume that people would probably stick to, e-commerce over in-store shopping, and e-commerce rates would remain high. And then in scenario number 3, we just assume if there's another pandemic, or even a great outbreak, the governments will probably shut down faster than before in the attempt to stop COVID-19 from happening again, which would lead to drastic, increase in e-commerce sales, and a lean away from in-store shopping. So last but not least, for car and public transportation long-term, one interesting study that we found was one talking about autonomous vehicles and platoons, as well as the Hyperloop and other future modes of transportation, probably sort of dismantling the current public transportation systems. It was an interesting read, and it could potentially pose a threat, especially in considering the pandemic. So the autonomous vehicle platoons essentially would be self-driving vehicles that would be cars that would line up in big rows and essentially operate like a train full of cars. And there was a case made that those vehicles would be safer than public transportation because people would be in individual vehicles instead of being compacted into one condensed space, which would reduce the risk. So it's just interesting also seeing that future modes of transportation could potentially threaten some of the current modes of transportation, especially in context of a pandemic. So just, we said that in scenario number 1, that a mostly return to normal, telecommuting would displace some level of commuters, which we're experiencing right now. Many of us, including myself, would be, working from home, so we would not be commuting. But it's also interesting to think that people who are being displaced from public transportation because private car is a preference would be pushed towards private car, which could lead to increases in private car travel, even though the pandemic, the effects of the pandemic would be decreasing private car travel. It would be the people being displaced from public transportation would likely tend, especially those who have the wealth and the capacity to do so, would prefer private car transportation. In scenario number 2, that there would be an even greater displacement of computers to telecommuting. Of course, if in the situation that we could foresee going forward, that the COVID-19 still poses a threat, and that there are restrictions continuing to be re-implemented and whatnot, we would see even an even larger displacement of people away from public transportation towards private car. Some of the things that we did find in studies is that while people are working from home so much, they like to sort of escape from the home environment and engage in leisurely travel, travel with family, even during the pandemic. This was found to be true. And it could just be interesting that new traffic patterns could potentially emerge, in the sense that if everyone's working from home after work hours, it's even possible that a large group of people would say, hey, once work is done and we're working from home, let's go on some sort of leisurely travel, even in the midst of the pandemic, and it could lead to new traffic patterns and off of our traditional rush hours. And then in scenario number 3, of course, that the pandemic, there would be another pandemic. There would be a mass shutdown of public transportation, and private car would likely be the most popular mode of transportation, because of the reduced risk. So just some additional notes that we just wanted to put out here before the presentation ends is that even during the pandemic, transportation numbers were actually increasing back to normal. A study in Colombia and a few other studies found that even initially, transportation numbers drastically dropped, but the graph showed that every mode of transportation was steadily increasing back to normal, even in the midst of the pandemic, which actually contributed, to the second wave of the pandemic in many countries. So that's one thing to take into consideration. And something else is that punishments associated with regulations and policies seem to discourage violators. So we know during the pandemic, even though there was policies released trying to restrict travel behaviors, there are people violating those policies or those laws or regulations. And if they see that for whatever reason that there's a low risk of me being punished, as a result of me violating, and they see that whatever benefit they can gain from violating the behavior, whatever regulation there are, they may in fact, pursue whatever they want to pursue, even though regulations are in place. So that's all for our presentation. I wish there was time to go into some of the future work or the recent work that we've been doing, but I believe my time is up right now. So thank you everyone for listening on to my presentation. I know I was rushing through it and going very fast, but if there's any questions, feel free to ask. I see that there were some in the chat.
Yes, Justin, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So we have actually a couple of questions. So I would like to start with from Maher, who raised his hand first.
No, I didn't have a question. I was just clapping.
Okay, thank you. Then Dr. Enam asked a question, which is, how did you limit the number of papers you reviewed for your work? And did you use any set of keywords to contain the search results?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the question. Being completely honest, I didn't limit the number of papers that I reviewed in the research, and I did not contain the search results. I'm glad hearing this. This was actually my first research paper, literature review paper that I have done. So, I'm appreciative for the feedback that I would take that into consideration in the future. So I didn't limit the number of papers, which would have been useful to do so.
How many papers did you review for this study?
How many papers in total?
Yes, approximately. Just curious.
In total, probably about 40. But in the that was actually included for in the paper last maybe 30 or so.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. So we have a question from Mr. Niles.
Hi there, folks. Justin, sir, you were extraordinarily pessimistic about the future of transit as I read you across your three scenarios. I just want to begin with a comment that our federal government, and I'm speaking in a US context, our federal government is in a very strong effort to try to get people back on transit. And one of the bases of that is that transit is safe, that the evidence that people get sick from riding transit is quite weak. There aren't a lot of cases of it, that the mask mandate is working, that people are distancing, and let's face it, the ridership levels on transit are very low. But there's a great deal of concern because right now, in many US cities, if not across the country, car driving mobility is back. I mean, people want to go places, even with all commuting, but transit ridership is distinctly down. Are you optimistic at all that transit can come back? Because our country, the USA, is very strongly, as a matter of policy, trying to restore transit, almost like the way it was. Right? I mean, buses are okay, and it's needed for essential services, and some people need to ride it, but we've got to get the ridership back up or it will lose public support because it's largely subsidized. Can you comment on what you see as the future of transit in America? And I think it'd be somewhat similar in many first world countries.
Yeah, that's a very, very good input and very good question. I do, in the presentation, it did seem very a negative outlook on the future, but I really think that the biggest thing discovered from all the literature review is that people's perception of feeling safe is the biggest factor. So in spite of the fact that, obviously the research, may suggest if there are efforts made really publicizing that public transportation is safe, efforts are made in that way, and the public does, in fact, feel safe. I do believe there's hope, but if there's no, at least in my, from the studies that we've done, if there's no way to sort of get the public to believe it's safe, then it could definitely be in danger. So that would be my, the best input that I would have.
Anybody else? So there has been work done to make the breathable air inside transit vehicles absolutely positively safe? There are 3 ways to do it, and they all cost money. But don't forget, there's a lot of money pouring into transit, and I'm wondering if transit agencies shouldn't focus on that more. Creating interior air in transit vehicles that is certifiably virus safe. There's filtering, there's ultraviolet treatment, and I mean where the air that's in the circulatory system runs by ultraviolet, and then there's actually mist treatments, which have been worked on by Luminator, which I think are more controversial, but have shown to be effective. Do you think it would be important, as I do, for transit agencies, and this could work around the world, to do much more work on making the interior atmosphere in transit vehicles guaranteed safe, which would go along with masking? I mean, the airlines are talking a lot about that, but I haven't heard the transit agencies quite so much. Sometimes there's the feeling, oh, we've got the driver shielded off with plexiglass and she or he has their window open, so they're okay. But, you know, the back of the bus is, you know, well, separate as best you can, wear a mask, etc. What do people feel about the basic task of making transit vehicles safer to breathe in? Anybody got anything on that?
So any of our speakers and even audience, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, I would like to. I work in Palm Beach County in the state of Florida, and based on the situation we have encountered here, the transit agency during the pandemic time period, as you can expect, the ridership is way down. And whether or not after the pandemic's is over, I wish this would be over soon, whether the ridership can be backing up, I guess this will take the paradigm shift for that to occur. However, they defined out while the public transit, the buses are free operation, the ridership is way down. However, they find that the paratransit, all the door-to-door services is actually increased substantially. So I guess the transit agency, what they can do during the pandemic or even after the pandemic, the direction they can gear to is to promote the non-fixed route, non-fixed demand, the paratransit operations. And the director here is also agreed that they would spend more infrastructures, the increase of fleet for the small car transportation,
Yes, so do we have any questions or comment in this topic, or in fact, any questions from any other previous presentations? I think we have 9 more minutes. So a few quick things. So the 2 presenters actually shared their paper and the reports with us. So you can find it in the chat box. So Elisa shared her paper, and also Dr. Wadud shared the full report and the summary report about the study that happened in Bangladesh. And also in the meantime, there is an interesting paper which is shared on teleworking productivity, a natural experiment, which is published in Findings. And also Mr. Niles shared the link about the US federal government's various effort in public transit agencies for carrying a strong funded effort to convince people to ride transit. And yeah, there is another link is just posted also. Feel free to look at them. So I would like to thank all of our speakers for the nice presentation today, and all these recorded versions will be posted shortly in our website. And if we don't have any other questions, I think that's all for today. I would love to give the 8 minutes back, but feel free to visit our other sessions that is going on concurrently today in the BTR conference. So I think that's all today. Thank you so much. Have a good afternoon.